Many people often contemplate reincarnation in another uncharted world. Such dreamers imagine themselves on adventures in mystical places and how they use magical abilities. Other dreamers would love to gather a harem of beautiful girls and get the best pleasures of life. And some would sincerely wish to become the saviors of the world and defeat terrible monsters like the dragon. All this certainly sounds very cool and inspires many fools, but alas, the reality was not like that. A young guy survived reincarnation into a new world was a puppet and did not experience the joy of it at all. This young hero's name in his new life was Carmine de la Garde Bungard, and he was ready to fight for his happiness. This story of a young heir will tell how Carmine will become an emperor. The story will offer a lot of emotions and experiences, so put aside your business and worries in order to immerse yourself in this journey. Many believe that souls after death do not die with the body, but only change their address of stay. But for this it is necessary to overcome time and space, and also thanks to the higher powers to get a chance for rebirth. Such a chance fell to a young boy, who left his former world too early because of an accident, and now his soul was rushing to meet his new, just-born body. When he opened his eyes for the first time in his new life, he didn't understand where he was and who all these people were and why they spoke a similar, but very strange language. The man from the other world did not even understand who was shouting so loudly and nastily, because it made his head hurt and he just wanted silence. But then came the realization that it was his own scream. All this could be the consequences of the fact that the mental body was not quite synchronized with the physical. But the next days for the reborn guy went as if someone put the movie on rewind. Gradually, the outline of the world around him and the surrounding colors became clearer, and an understanding of the local language came. It was strange for a man from modern Japan to realize that he was now not only in a new world, but also in a new body. And it was strange that the memories of his past life had not disappeared. The guy noticed that the room was made in Western style and everything pointed to the absence of any modern elements. Also, the guy couldn't understand why his mom was constantly changing, and eventually it became clear that it was just different nanas who took care of him carefully. The guy noticed that all the girls always said the same word when they picked him up, which could be his name or social status. After a while, the guy started to feel something strange in the air, which he had never felt before and was very curious to know what it was. Soon a few months passed and the transfigured guy could still only think about what was going on around him and observe people. Because of the peculiarities of his age, he was constantly crying, and this immediately attracted the attention of adults who rushed to comfort him. Such a rebirth the guy did not expect and imagined everything differently. After all, he was a helpless child who was completely dependent on other people. It was a little sad because of not being able to get to the god and get cheater abilities, and maybe his not so good karma had influenced it. The guy began to realize that he had absolutely no recollection of exactly how he died in his past life, and his memories of his past life were a bit vague. He remembered his past family and what he did well, but he couldn't remember names or any small details. The guy also remembered that he was a very mistrustful person, and so he didn't have any close friends, just casual acquaintances. Pressed by the memories, he felt tears flowing down his cheeks again, and it was a reaction to any emotion. Emotional swings constantly intensified and made him scream and cry, and so the adults immediately came to him. It was impossible to cope with such a state, and the guy decided to deal with the situation as far as he could at all. Eventually managed to figure out his Carmine de la Garde Bungard, and it was an incredibly long word, so it was easier to just call himself Carmine. And the most interesting thing was that he turned out to be the emperor of the Bungard Empire. It was a strange situation, because how could a boy who had just been born immediately become the ruler of the empire? In the end, Carmine found out that there were two people in power right now. The first of these people was the strict Chancellor Karl de Van Raoul. The second was the Master of Ceremonies, Philippe de Garde-Kikar. Apparently, both of them were dukes with the blood of the royal family in them. Carmine also guessed that the empire was currently being torn apart by a power struggle. It was a normal phenomenon, because people at all times craved for power, and desperately fought for it using the most cruel and cunning methods. Carmine didn't understand why a child should be made emperor in such a case, although such cases had happened more than once in history. Carmine remembered from the school history course about how in 1317 years it happened in France with Joan I of the Capeting dynasty. When his father Louis X died, only his daughter Jean was left after him, but she could not take the throne as the queen was pregnant at the time. So Louis X's younger brother became regent and waited for the queen to give birth. Eventually a boy named John was born, who became the rightful king immediately after his birth. But then this child died just a week after his birth, and Louis X's younger brother took the throne and became King Philip V. It was not a very pleasant story and once again proved that the life of an heir is not so easy. There was a similar story in China in the 106th year in the province of Han. It happened after the death of the 4th Emperor He Han. The child Liu Lun was received at court and enthroned as the rightful emperor. This boy was enthroned more than 100 days after his birth. Meanwhile, his relatives competed fiercely in politics, and a year later, this minor emperor died under very strange circumstances. Carmine was horrified and realized that he too could be killed by someone during the power struggle. It was a horrible feeling, and it seemed that death itself was now watching him relentlessly. Carmine felt fear and felt an incredible anxiety that painted horrible pictures in his mind. But then turning around, the guy did not see anything scary. Carmine decided that it was just his paranoia and decided that now he needed to be more careful about the people around him. Carmine didn't want to die again, and especially didn't want to be emperor if given the choice. The sad emotions brought tears to his eyes again, and a nanny rushed over to the boy. The girl smiled sweetly and called the lad a little emperor who was probably just hungry. Carmine was indignant and tried to tell her that he didn't need to be killed at all, because he had just gotten a new life. But the girl of course only heard a child crying. Carmine eventually calmed down and decided that there must still be some way to survive in this situation. Also, the guy did not stop feeling a strange phenomenon in the air, which had not passed since his birth. Carmine decided that maybe it was something magical and it could be related to him. This whole world was reminiscent of some kind of European fantasy, and burn could really be magic. Carmine was sure of it. After all, he had been reborn in another world for a reason, and now all that was left was to continue his observations. Carmine of course did not know how exactly to use magic powers, but he decided to try to do it. The guy tried to imagine that he could control the wind and began to dab with his hands, but nothing happened and it only made the girl smile. Carmine got angry because of the nanny's taunts and decided that he would definitely get results in the future. A few days later, it turned out that all the aristocrats were to gather for some purpose. Carmine was anxiously awaiting this event and hoped that nothing would happen to him. Though it was obvious that if they wanted to assassinate him, it would be better to do it while he was at such a vulnerable age. And even with the most advanced medicine, the mortality rate in infancy is always high, so it's easy to disguise an assassination attempt as a disease. Carmine also realized that if he is not killed, then in such a case, they will definitely try to use him. Although perhaps it is even worse, because to live as a puppet all his life is a terrible and humiliating fate. A puppet usually becomes a puppet in the hands of the person who most wants to gain power and stands out. The servant announced that all the people gathered today had come to wish His Majesty a happy new year. Carmine looked carefully at the numerous aristocrats and decided that he would definitely find out those who hid their true deceitful plans under false smiles. The aristocrats rejoiced and congratulated the young emperor on the holiday, telling how happy they were to be near him. But Carmine sensed their lies and saw their true intentions. All of this only frustrated and made him uncomfortable. This reincarnation was not at all the exciting journey that computer games made it out to be. Carmine was relying on his past life experience and innate suspiciousness, and it remained to be seen if he could survive in this treacherous world among dangerous and cunning aristocrats. Emperor Carmine was learning a lot of new things every day, and rejoiced at the discoveries that motivated him to explore this world. Now the guy knew exactly the name of his empire and some of the nuances in his rule. The most unpleasant thing was the constant fear of assassination attempts that literally haunted the juvenile emperor. It had been a little over a year since Carmine had been reborn in the new world, but it still seemed like a fantasy. To be reborn as a helpless infant in the status of emperor of a not-so-stable empire. And it became obvious that once he became disfavored, the treacherous aristocrats would immediately get rid of him. Carmine was constantly worried about this and asked God why he brought him such an ordeal, because everything could have been done much easier. Carmine looked out the window and noticed that the sunny weather was perfect and the bad thoughts receded a bit. For all his great status, the young emperor felt like a bird in a golden cage and had no choice but to sit in his room and look out the window. Although usually in such a position were lovely princesses waiting for their prince on a white horse. While looking out the window, Carmine suddenly noticed the maid doing something strange. The young girl was able to light a fire with a wave of her hand without any improvised objects, and it was amazing. Carmine was impressed, because it was the first time he saw the manifestation of magic in his new life, and although it lasted only a moment, but the young emperor noticed a strange bright flash. There could be no mistake, and it was indeed a magical method used by the locals. He wanted to see more, but Carmine was distracted by another maid. This time the nanny offered the little emperor to take a walk in the garden today, and it surprised him very much, because he didn't even expect such a gift. Being forever in four walls was too depressing, and of course it was necessary to go out from time to time for fresh air, warm sun rays and fresh breeze. The weather was very nice indeed, and the scent of beautiful summer flowers could be heard everywhere, as well as birdsong. Carmen looked at the clear blue sky and thought about the fact that of course the emperor would not be allowed to lie on the ground and enjoy nature, so he was forced to stay in a rather cramped special basket. His mother, meanwhile, just wanted to rest in the fresh air and drink some fragrant tea, because apparently she was also very tired of some of her worries and was happy to have a quiet environment. But Carmine after a while was disappointed with such a walk, because it was almost no different from the tedious stay in a closed room, and it was very boring. The young emperor kept remembering the time when he saw the manifestation of magic power, and decided to try to use magic too, although last time he failed. Carmine felt that something strange was in the air, and he had felt it since he was born and was sure that it was definitely related to magical energy. Carmine really wanted to somehow learn how to manipulate these forces at will, and maybe then he would understand why he had no guards. After all, every ruler, much less one as vulnerable as him, should have a personal guard to protect him. It would have been nice to get his hands on some good textbook on magic, but Carmine realized that he absolutely could not read the local symbols, and it would hardly help with the problem. Also, the young emperor thought that if he stood out a lot, he would definitely be finished off, because nobody wanted a ruler who could use magic and wanted to become independent in the future. This whole situation was annoying, and there seemed to be no way out of this impasse. But gradually Carmine began to imagine how to use magic, and at some point he tried to summon water. After a few seconds, an incredible thing happened, and a drop of water appeared in front of the little emperor, which after hanging in the air for a short time fell and broke into a lot of splashes. Carmine was delighted and did not even immediately believe that he was able to realize his thoughts, but it was strange why all previous attempts were unsuccessful. The young emperor decided to continue his attempts and create some more magic, but unfortunately he was interrupted and told that it was time for His Majesty to return to the room. Carmine tried to resent it as much as he could, because he wanted to go for a longer walk in the fresh air to test his magical abilities. But the girl was adamant, especially besides the child's crying. She did not understand anything. After waiting for night in complete silence, Carmine decided to continue his magic experiments and cautiously looked out to see if anyone was around. The maid who was supposed to watch over the young emperor throughout the night was safely asleep and had completely let her guard down. This was the perfect chance to test his magical abilities again, and Carmine once again tried to summon the power of water to create a drop. But unfortunately this time it didn't work, and Carmine thought that maybe the problem was that he was indoors now, while he had been outdoors before. Then the young emperor suggested that not all people in this world can use magic, and the magic itself could be used to successfully assassinate him. And the only way to prevent an assassination attempt on the ruler of a state was to forbid the use of magic inside a dwelling. Carmine realized that there was probably some kind of magical tool or barrier that was in the room and blocked any magical energy, and what he felt constantly in the air was some kind of blocking magic. Of course, Carmine had absolutely no understanding of how exactly the magic of this world worked and what its value was, and in this situation one could only speculate and guess about all these complex processes. The only way to study the magical powers of this world was possible only after studying the mythology and various legends of the past. And if all of this was a manifestation of some spirit's magic, it would make it much more difficult to study it. Carmine decided not to despair and continue his research, and in this situation to try to study the available thing that was always with him. Since the emperor was still an ordinary infant, he defecated everywhere and could not control this process, which at such a young age is a common thing. Of course, the adult consciousness was a bit embarrassed to experience and understand all this, but eventually Carmine got used to it. In fact, in this world, there were no diapers created from uncomfortable cloth and which need to be changed every time a child pees at the most inopportune moment. For these problems in this magical world there was a completely different object, which of course did not exist in modern Japan, from which the young ruler of the empire moved. The first time after his birth, Carmine was very worried because he did not know what it would be like to wear this strange object every day. But eventually the emperor decided to forget about it, as this device did not bring any discomfort at all. But of course this thing was very strange to the understanding of a person from another world, and now that the existence of magic had been proven, Carmine was absolutely sure that this strange device was magical. This strange magic tool consisted of a small tube and a special tip. This tip was changed daily and the tube was removed while bathing. This special tool perfectly absorbed all the secretions so the body remained clean and fresh, and it was a perfect solution for such problems. Apparently, this tool activated some sort of water absorption, compression, or excretory transfer magic. But it was strange why this magical item worked indoors, and so the key to unlocking the mystery of magical powers was hidden in this particular item. After a while, Carmen noticed that the tip of the device was not always replaced with exactly the same one, and the tips were of different shapes with an engraved mark. Perhaps this mark was something like a trademark of the craftsman who made these tips, and it was becoming more and more obvious that this was indeed a magical tool. Carmine still couldn't understand if these tips were disposable, and if so, the artisan must have made them by hand. The young emperor didn't know the cost of this tool, but he assumed that it was most likely very costly to constantly buy such unique tips. It was not surprising though, as Carmen was the emperor, and his upkeep was not to be skimped on and spent as much as needed. Carmen wondered if all this was normal, because if people were dissatisfied and revolted, then he would definitely be executed by guillotine. Carmen decided that if he had the opportunity, he would certainly apologize to the people, but now he just had to watch and wait for something new. But despite all the events, Carmen felt desperate and began to realize that in this world there is a certain reserve of magical power, and this reserve of power becomes bigger for each person every time he uses magic. That's why Carmen decided to try to use magic powers every day in order to grow faster. Also, Carmen decided that in this world, there was no way to open something like a system menu to check his stats, and even if the powers would increase, it's unclear how to find out. But unfortunately, it was still impossible to use magic in the room, and to tone up his magical abilities it was necessary to go out into the garden. Carmen decided that he should definitely learn how to use magic, and even came up with his own unique method for this. To do this, the young emperor would simply start crying unbearably to attract maximum attention. Carmen would cry when the maid who was always making mistakes tried to calm him down, and he would also cry when the caring nanny tried to calm him down. And only when Carmen was taken outside for fresh air the young emperor began to smile, and immediately stopped talking. In this way, Carmen made sure that everyone immediately realized that in order to calm him down, he must be urgently carried out into the fresh air. The young emperor tried to practice his magical abilities when no one was looking at him and began to gradually develop. First, Carmine became completely convinced that there was magical power inside his body. And if one utilized the magical power in the body and in the air, it became much easier to use magical abilities. This whole process was like collecting iron sand with a magnet. As it turned out, magic power was quite easy to collect and easy to manipulate. And if one only used magic power from the air, then magic was hard to control and did not come out well practiced. That was why the young emperor decided to use the magic power in his body. Secondly, Carmine was able to figure out the reserve of magic power. Although with this, it was still unclear whether the overall level of magic power in the body was increasing or not. After all, it was difficult to operate without any system in this magical world. However, when Carmen used the magic power from the body, it seemed to him that it almost didn't decrease, although of course it wasn't accurate. But one still wanted to possess an endless supply of energy. Carmen assumed that perhaps it was possible because he used the power from the body to start the spell, and the power from the air to activate the magic. Thirdly, the young emperor had once been able to use magic, and his perception of the world around him had helped him understand exactly how magic worked in this world. For example, creating a ball of water was much easier the day after a rainstorm, and after sunny days, more energy was needed for this spell. Carmen of course knew that there was water in the atmosphere, and so probably with the help of magic managed to unconsciously collect this water into water balloons. And in the end, everything depended on the humidity in the air. In the process of his experiments, the young emperor also learned how to create ice with the help of magical powers, and it pleased him, because it was nice to feel the coolness in his hand. This process did not depend on temperature or humidity, and it was possible to create a piece of ice from almost nothing. While creating the ice block, Carmine visualized a computer game and anime he had seen in a past life. From this, several conclusions about magic could be drawn. First, the magic in the body that directly started the magic process depended on the magic in the air. This process was not different and did not depend on the type of magic, but further still the difference was noticed. Water creating magic used magic from the air, and gathered water from the atmosphere into a water ball. Ice creating magic used only magic powers from the air without any moisture gathering. Carmine was fully convinced of these differences, for in order to create ice he fantasized and recalled events from popular games and anime, and so the magic power itself took the form of ice. But even with these discoveries, the young emperor wasn't sure which method of the two was best to put into practice. Carmine suggested that perhaps he would be able to dispel his notion of creating water over time, and now it would be better to focus on the new magic and try to use the other spells as well. Need to do this before the people who had decided to let him live for now changed their minds and decided to make an assassination attempt. Carmine promised himself to become as strong as possible to protect himself. A few days later, the weather was favorable and the young emperor was once again outside in a beautiful flower garden. Carmine decided to take this opportunity to try and create something new. He wanted to find out exactly how magic was blocked indoors and why magical tools worked despite such a blockage of magical energy. It was also interesting to find out how the stock of magical powers worked and what their quantity was and how perception affected the magic created. There were so many questions, and Carmine wanted to learn to be happy after his such a strange reincarnation into a young emperor. Carmine decided to start doing what he himself wanted to do and be happy about it. Trying to concentrate and visualize the world around him as magical energy, Carmine tried to make the wind blow. After a few seconds, the result was successful and many leaves began to swirl around the garden, and it was a ray of hope for the young emperor. Emperor is the title of a monarch, the most important of kings, the head of state ruling over several nations, which is awarded to the most outstanding people in history. That was all Carmine remembered from his high school history course in his past life. But for now, this great emperor had been cared for and followed everywhere by maids and nanas and even helped to eat. But now that care had diminished a bit, and there was a reason for it. Carmine had already grown considerably by the time he was 2 years old and could now move around on his own. And his teeth had grown and he could chew normal food. Eating with a spoon became a real pleasure, although clumsiness in his hands was still present, and the young emperor often dropped his cutlery on the floor. At such moments, the maid immediately came to the rescue and advised Carmine to take his time and began to help with the food. These awkward once again reminded that the lad was still trapped in the body of a 2-year-old and he was still too weak and not ready to live on his own. He had to continue to play the role of an unsuspecting child, and it was already quite annoying, because he was constantly being looked after by someone, and mostly it was very beautiful maids. In addition to being able to move around on his own, the young emperor learned to talk. And of course he did not speak at such a high level, so that it did not cause excessive suspicion, and tried to match his age as much as possible. After all, if someone finds out that Carmine knows how to communicate at the level of adults, and then he could immediately have a problem. So the alien from another world tried to do with just a few phrases. But nevertheless, Carmine was glad to be able to communicate even in such a limited format, but still forgot to ask a question. After all, the stories of caring maids were an important source of information for the quite adult mind of the emperor. After all, there was no one else around who could tell about the surrounding magical world. Carmine always listened very carefully to the conversations of the maids, and once heard the girls mention the master of ceremonies in the context of something very important, but then very quickly stopped the conversation. Carmine of course didn't miss this chance and asked them to tell him who the master of ceremonies was. One of the maids explained that this important person was actually a grandfather to Carmine, and it was a surprising revelation. It was a great way to get information, as the unsuspecting maids would always answer the question of a cute child who was all the more a local great ruler. But unfortunately one couldn't get too out of the role of a little child and was left to ask the simplest, most elementary questions. But of course, compared to the time when Carmine was still a small infant, much has changed, because now it was possible to collect important information. In addition, the silly maids of course did not suspect anything, being near a small child, and very often gossiped about anything, thus telling about important events and people. At such moments, Carmine enjoyed the flow of information, although he considered it very unprofessional behavior of the maids, because they allowed themselves to gossip in front of their emperor. But of course, Carmine did not want these girls to stop doing what they loved to do, because their endless gossip was a valuable source of information. In addition, a suspicious elderly man had recently started to frequent the young emperor's room, and Carmine did not like him at all with his defiant appearance. This elderly aristocrat was the young emperor's grandfather, Prime Minister Charles de Van Real. And at first glance this man always seemed to be happy to meet his grandson and pretended to be happy for his well-being. The maids discussed Prime Minister Karl very often, and as far as Carmine understood from these conversations, this man had the most power in the empire at the moment. And as Prime Minister, he was directly involved in the political life of the state, influencing almost everything. All this only further depressed the young emperor, because in fact he was supposed to be the source of absolute power in this state, but because of his young age only remained a pathetic puppet. The prime minister also had the nickname Lord Rail, because in fact he controlled almost the entire empire, and from the point of view of the faction of the ceremonium master, this man skillfully used his political position in order to fill his pockets with budget money. But of course, it should not be forgotten that Prime Minister Raoul was a relative of Carmine's, and to be precise, Raoul was the eldest son of Carmine's great-grandfather's brother, as well as the brother of his late great-grandmother. So Carmine found out that his grandfather Edward IV was the previous emperor, and his grandmother Carol were actually cousins. But the most interesting thing was that before the marriage between his grandfather and grandmother, cousin marriages were forbidden and considered a criminal offense. For what exact reason the church allowed this allegedly criminal union of two relatives, Carmine of course did not know and could only speculate based on his own knowledge. But most likely it was due to the fact that Carl's younger brother was the head of the local religion of the so-called His Holiness George V, and these two men were constantly doing anything to strengthen their family's position. That's why they adjusted not only the politics of the state, but also the religion of the whole nation. But apart from these aristocratic representatives, there was another rather elderly man present in this entire story, who the young emperor had also begun to see often recently. This man was the master of ceremonies Philippe de Gardy-Kikar, and he also always showed joy at the sight of the young emperor, expressing his respect and appreciation. As far as Carmine understood, Philippe was also his grandfather, and he was usually called Lord Akikar, or the Great Lord, because every lord in this country had his own territory. The master of ceremonies, Philip, was indeed one of the young emperor's relatives. He was the father of Carmine's mother and was a direct maternal grandfather. According to the faction of Prime Minister Charles, the master of ceremonies Philip was very skillful in manipulating his daughter, the Empress Dowager. In addition, he increased the number of government posts and greatly inhibited the development of politics. Philip was constantly handing out government positions to members of his faction, which he himself had invented. Of course, each of these positions was paid from the state treasury, and thus the cunning Philip pulled money from the treasury into the pocket of his faction. These two cunning and deceitful old men were constantly visiting the young emperor, inquiring about his well-being and always saying nasty things about each other, trying to exert their influence over Carmine from a young age. Carmine actually thought that it was very stupid and useless to say such things to a child at his age, and as far as he remembered, all this was called the most common indoctrination of some necessary knowledge into the child's mind. In general, both of these conflicting factions, controlled by Prime Minister Charles and his adversary, Master of Ceremonies Philip, were constantly fighting for their influence within the great empire. However, at the moment, as far as the young emperor was concerned, Prime Minister Charles' faction had the upper hand and largely outweighed the influence of Master of Ceremonies Philip. Carmine did not understand why this was the case, as the position of regent was held by a man from the faction of Master of Ceremonies Philip. Although the young emperor himself did not belong to his grandfather Philip's faction, despite his close family ties, the duty of the regent was to help the young emperor until he came of age, and it was actually a very responsible position that required attention, at least it should have been. The regent was the daughter of the ceremonial master, that is Carmine's own mother, a girl named Alexia, and for the young emperor it was of course the closest person. But for some reason Alexia did not come to the young emperor for a very long time. Carmine also learned that her second child, who was recently born, died of an illness, and so she did not leave her room, continuing to grieve over it. As a result of his observations and the stories of the maids, Carmine also learned that his father, Crown Prince Jean, had died before he was born. As far as it was clear, he had died in battle, though of course it could have been a trivial assassination attempt. In the end, the situation was as follows. The young emperor Alexia's mother simply left her son alone and locked herself in her room. And her recent child, who was conceived in a relationship with some aristocrat lover, died of illness. And apparently the collection had a relationship with the lover before her husband Jean died. Although despite the fact that the death of that child is explained by illness, it all looked very suspicious, because he was the second potential heir to the throne of the empire. And at the moment Alexia was feeling very ill, and was constantly fainting after long nights of mourning her dead son. Carmine was almost certain that his grandfather, the Master of Ceremonies Philip, was behind the young child's death, and it was all very sad. Reflecting on his family problems, Carmen often thought of his mom from his past life. Although those memories were a bit vague, he remembered some details. The difference between the two women was of course enormous, and in this situation it was very difficult to call Alexia his real mother, because he felt nothing for her and rarely saw her. The maids often talked about all this, and since the maids were aware of the various processes within the leadership of the empire, then most likely the rest of the people guessed about it. Analyzing all the information, the young emperor felt that his state was doomed and he was ashamed to be the ruler of such a dysfunctional country. Also lately he had stopped being visited by caring nannies, and the reason was that the young emperor no longer needed to be fed, because he was becoming more and more independent every day. Carmine was surprised at the sheer number of people who constantly took care of him during his short life. Among them were 7 independent aristocrat nannies, 10 maids from the Prime Minister's faction, and 10 maids from the Ceremonial Master's faction. All of these nannies were independent aristocrats, and the young emperor felt a bit sorry that such intelligent and educated women were no longer around him. Independent aristocrats were aristocrats who didn't belong to the Ceremonial Master's faction or the Prime Minister's faction. Although unfortunately such aristocrats were few in number, they were the ones who had the final say in the Supreme Court of the Empire. Most of the independent aristocrats were officials who did not own their own territory, unlike Raoul or Philip, their own land holdings, and treasured them very much. Many aristocrats in their factions also had their own land holdings and felt much more elevated than the independent aristocrats. Carmine decided that if he ever got involved in politics, the independent aristocrats should be the first to support him. After all, if the empire collapsed, the independent aristocrats would be at a major disadvantage. Without belonging to one of the factions and without having their own territory, these people will be left with nothing. That was why, fearing the worst, many independent aristocrats had recently started to join different factions, because they were really afraid of losing their status. Carmine was surprised at how cruel this world was and regretted that he was the person at the very center of many treacherous people's interests. And if he was deprived of the help of independent aristocrats in the future, it would be a verdict on him as an independent ruler. Therefore, it is better to stay out of politics, because it is associated with huge risks. Realizing how dangerous the life of a young ruler can be, Carmine constantly remembered his mother Alexia, and her dead child, who died only because he had a chance to interfere with someone. With the heavy power struggle between the two factions, if the emperor were to die in the arms of his own nanny who belonged to one of the factions, that faction would instantly be brought to justice and accused of killing the ruler. And even if it wasn't a premeditated murder, it couldn't be ruled out that children often died of diseases in this world, because medicine was too low, even with people's magical abilities. Carmine realized that if he died, another ruler would be chosen after him, and the party that would be responsible for his death would not be able to put their puppet on the throne, and all this was difficult to realize. That's why the only people from the factions around the young emperor are the servants who take care of him throughout the time, which means Carmine is constantly surrounded by potential enemies who could kill him at any time. All these girls who were specially assigned to him were certainly not going to take the initiative to teach the young emperor anything good. Although these girls showed feigned care and benevolence and were interested in the young emperor's desires, Carmine did not want to call these lovely girls enemies. After all, they were really just actors who had been drawn into this insidious game, but he still had to be careful. After all, you have to realize that this whole story is arranged by people who own the power in the country. And in the empire there is a situation in which ordinary people have no choice but to follow the orders of treacherous aristocrats. Carmine promised himself that he would never forgive Prime Minister Karl and Master of Ceremonies Philip for wanting to use him as a puppet. That was why Carmine really disliked the people in power in his past life. It was very frustrating to be reborn in a new world only to be subjected to some devious and insolent people. Carmine sometimes regretted that he had not been able to be reborn in the body of a high-ranking aristocrat, because then everything would have been much easier. In that case, he would have been able to wield magic in peace and not depend on the perfidy of his relatives. And now one must learn how to use magic in order to simply survive, and perhaps even try to escape with the help of magical powers. Carmine really wanted to learn how to become invisible, because it would help to leave the palace unnoticed. The young emperor decided that as soon as he reached an independent age, he would definitely try to escape, because it would be nice to live a new life as a normal person and not be afraid every day that he would be killed by close relatives. This would be a better option than living constantly in fear and expecting a knife in the back. After all, I just wanted to live quietly enjoying the new magical world and not worry about anything. To realize this goal, Carmen decided to continue to increase his stock of magical power to try to create more complex spells, and then he would be able to show the treacherous aristocrats what a simple man from another world is capable of, because he was given a new life, not to live it as a stupid puppet. Carmine constantly reminded himself and strengthened his confidence that he should not be a toy in other people's hands, because it was the most humiliating thing that could ever be. The fearless warrior named Carmen, without feeling tired and disregarding his terrible wounds, continued to hold his mighty blade tightly. Carmen was ready to stop the terrible dragon, the monster that brought only death of destruction, and to do it even at the cost of his own life. For such was the true hero, destroying demons and monsters. Without fear, but only feeling anger and rage, Carmen skillfully dodged the fiery shots of the enraged dragon, trying to get closer to the monster and give him a fatal blow. His strong arms were ready to thrust his steel blade into the monster and win another magnificent victory to bask in the glory and approval of the world. Carmen was confident in himself and in his strength, and already felt how heroically he would defeat the terrible dragon and once again feel the inexpressible feeling of victory. But suddenly everything ended, and his gaze once again stared at the very ceiling of the room, and the young emperor sighed regretfully. All this was only a dream, in which he had imagined himself a consummate adventurer, a hero who saves the world and innocent people, and then gets fame and love of the best beauties. Alas, the reality was quite different, and Carmen was reborn in the new world as the emperor of a not quite prosperous empire. And so it lasted for 3 years. Carmen of course realized that with such a high status, his dream of a great adventure will never come true, and he will not be able to destroy monsters and conquer the hearts of exotic beauties. After lying in a soft, cozy bed for a while, Carmen decided to practice using magic power again today, because only thanks to such abilities he could change something in his life. The young emperor had accidentally started using magic, and since then had been constantly trying to practice and improve his abilities. Gradually, the amount of magic that Carmen could use increased significantly, and it pleased the young emperor. During this time, Carmen was able to master the magic of several elements, and this was truly an outstanding achievement for a self-taught student. The young emperor didn't know if it was his innate talent or all the advantages that came with being reborn in a new body and in a new world. Carmen was also glad that he was now a little older and could control his body properly, and the ability to use magic added to his confidence. In some ways, it was like a computer game from a past life, where new abilities were unlocked as you progressed. But out of all the magic, Carmen wanted to focus on 2. The first was a magic that allowed you to move things through the air, and the young emperor called it manipulation magic. It was essentially ordinary telekinesis, which was very convenient and useful in its simplicity. But so far Carmen had learned to control only small and light objects like leaves or small stones, and was able to notice something interesting. It turned out that ice created with magic and a clump of earth ripped out with earth magic were much easier to control. This was a startling discovery, and Carmen rejoiced and decided that perhaps it was due to the fact that the volume and mass of the object was created with his own magic. But how it all worked exactly was not yet clear. The young emperor hoped to learn how to attack with telekinesis in the future, because it would give new opportunities for defense against possible attacks. The next magic ability may have looked silly, but it was still interesting. The second magic that interested the young emperor could manipulate the body. This was a magic that Carmine had learned while trying to freeze some objects. It turned out that freezing magic could be used when one simply imagined an object being frozen. But without understanding what heat energy is and imagining exactly how it works, magic will have no effect. And understanding all of this, ice magic was quite simple. In addition to all of this, Carmen constantly practiced using ice magic and eventually learned the opposite effect. That is, he learned how to heat objects. But also, the young emperor of course realized that because he was just a child, his body was too weak, and so there was a high probability of getting deathly ill and dying before an assassination attempt was made. Therefore, such magic was very useful and allowed one to regulate his body temperature. With this, one could easily warm up in the cold and cool down in the heat. The most important thing was that it was much easier and more efficient to transform the magical energy in one's body than to create a normal flame. Simply put, it was possible to generate more heat with less energy. Creating a flame would require 3 times more magical energy than just creating heat magic within the body. Understanding all these processes, Carmen felt joy and confidence in each new discovery. And then the young emperor realized that magical energy could become very hot if desired. Eventually, Carmen learned the heat ray attack, and it was an incredible accomplishment at the age of 3. The attacking ability was inspiring and motivating for new discoveries. However, this method of attack did not have an immediate effect, as it took some time to warm up the necessary target. Alas, it was difficult to defend against the assassin's surprise attack with this method of attack, and Carmen decided to look for another stronger method of fighting. Carmen decided that to begin with, he needed to learn how to manage the magical energy in his body much better. After all, internal magical energy is essentially the fuel to activate any magic. Realizing all this, the young emperor learned how to accumulate and contain the internal magic within his body and even activate it. It was a good exercise to practice controlling magical energy. Carmine wasn't completely sure, but he felt as if the concentration of magical energy in his body was becoming much higher than the concentration of magical energy in the air. But for now, this was just an assumption. But the most important thing was that every new training session brought results and hope. But despite all his successes, the young emperor still could not use magic indoors, and it caused some inconvenience. Waiting for complete darkness, the young emperor as usual saw in his room a sleeping maid, who was not going to faithfully do the job of guarding the great ruler. But none of that mattered, and Carmen decided to continue his magical research. Carmen hoped to learn invisibility magic, and every day he feared being killed in an assassination attempt, which meant that magic was going to be a major factor in his survival. And the ability of invisibility or illusion would be very useful skills in this endeavor. But so far, unfortunately, all attempts to become invisible or create illusion were unsuccessful. It was obvious that in order to activate magic in this world, one had to have a clear idea of what one wanted to achieve. Carmen understood this process when he visualized how he created ice or flames and everything worked. But how exactly to visualize the process of creating illusion or invisibility, Carmen did not know, and it caused constant irritation. The young emperor regretfully recalled that in his previous life he could find out anything with the help of Google's search engine, but now he could not. Having calmed down a bit, Carmen decided to still summarize everything he had learned during his experiments. The first thing Carmen knew for sure was that the activation of magic depends on natural phenomena such as temperature and humidity. The second was that it was important to have an idea for the use of magic. The third was that it was impossible to create magical processes that could not be imagined. Fourth, it was assumed that the concentration of magical energy in the body was higher than in the air. Fifth, Carmine realized that the magical energy in the body he could maintain even indoors. And the sixth was strange, but the magic item worn instead of diapers worked even indoors. Although the improvised magical diaper the young emperor wore only at night, because Carmine was already 3 years old and could go to the toilet on his own. But even so, Carmine still wanted to learn the device of this item. At the same time, it was surprising to learn that the toilets in this fantasy world were also flush toilets, but they were not like the toilets from his past life. The toilets here were shaped like a square and had a water flush system. This was surprising, because in their home world during the Middle Ages in Europe, there were no flush toilets at all. The only similar device in the past was used in ancient Rome, and perhaps it was something similar. Also, thanks to his many observations, Carmine realized that the tip of the magic diaper had some special magic. And apparently the magic was activated by some mechanism in the tip itself. And perhaps it was all about the engraved magic symbol on the tip of the device itself. The young emperor really wanted to have a clearer understanding of the process, but with his limited knowledge of this world, it was only possible to have a rudimentary understanding of the whole process. Carmine realized that if he started to study the magic tip now, it would start emitting light and it would wake up the sleeping maid. Therefore, it was now more important to learn about the magical energy that was in the air. It was interesting to find out if it would be possible to use the magic that was on the tip. Carmine tried to heat up the magical energy and see what would happen. The magic tip suddenly began to glow and the glow increased. Such a successful experiment inspired the young emperor, and the guy decided to continue his research. The tip of the magic diaper did indeed heat up, and this proved that there was a significant amount of magical energy concentrated within it. Because of the anti-magic barrier, Carmine couldn't use his magical abilities indoors, but he managed to find out something interesting. The young emperor found out that all the magical energy that was hovering in his room was completely blocked. To use magic, Carmine used magical energy from the air to transform it at will. The whole process was like creating something out of clay. It wasn't a bad idea to explain magical processes as if a ceramic bowl was being created. The clay was magical energy and had to be kneaded constantly in order to create an object like a bowl. and the finished bowl was the final magic. But if even the best piece of clay dried to a hard state, it would become unsuitable for creating dishes. It was on this principle that the magical energy in this room was blocked and remained completely useless for the use of magic. But despite this, the magic power inside the body and inside the magic tip was still active and usable. This was a real discovery for Carmine, and the young emperor rejoiced at his success. After all, if magic energy from the air was not being used, then activating magic was still possible, which meant that there was no magical item in this room that completely blocked any use of magic. These two important points made a lot of difference. Carmine realized that he couldn't trigger something that was created with magic in the room, which meant that with his current methods of activating magic, there would be no way to effectively defend himself during an attack. But then the young emperor realized that as he studied the magic item, he noticed for a moment a surge of magical energy within it. This meant that the magical energy released into the air was not blocked immediately. The young emperor decided that if he tried to release the magical energy from his body, then it wouldn't take long, but the spell would still be able to work. And if one were to imagine that a vicious assassin would enter this room with the intent to finish off the emperor, that knowledge would change everything. Carmine decided that he could still use magic to protect himself, though there was no 100% certainty in that theory. If it worked, it would be a great method of self-defense, but to be sure, of course, he would have to check everything beforehand. Carmine tried to concentrate and visualize the whole process of creating magic, and the most important problem was to cause a surge of the right power. The young emperor began to visualize the magical energy inside his body in the form of a liquid that passes through the muscles and skin, and it reached even the smallest parts of the body. After realizing how the magical energy was pulsing in the body, Carmine decided to try to convert the magical energy into heat energy and gradually began to feel the beginning of the process. After a few seconds, the hand did indeed heat up and a magical glow appeared. The experiment was successful and it pleased the young emperor. Carmine decided that his body contained quite a large concentration of magical energy because his hand became very hot. But then after a few seconds, the heat began to fade and the magical glow went out. Then the young emperor felt a sharp weakness and was frightened. Cold sweat poured down his face and his heartbeat increased greatly. After thinking for a while, Carmine realized that all of this was a sign that his body had run out of magical energy. This was a useful lesson, because today the young emperor had learned that once a person exhausted his magical energy, he would lose consciousness and resemble a dead battery. Carmine barely regained consciousness and did not understand why his room was so noisy and what was going on, because the emperor did not remember how he lost consciousness. But then Carmine began to reconstruct the picture of what had happened and remembered how he tested his ability to use magic in the room. And then his eyes darkened sharply. This sudden weakness was due to the fact that the young emperor had used up all the reserve of magical energy and fell asleep. And as it turned out, this worried the maids, and now the court doctor immediately rushed to see if everything was alright with the young ruler of the empire. The elderly and very attentive doctor began to ask if Carmine was alright and checked his pulse. Carmine replied that he was fine and was able to rest while sleeping. The emperor felt that some of the magical energy had already been restored and the body felt a surge of energy. Carmine speculated that perhaps in this world, people had a special organ that could generate magical energy. The young emperor also realized that he had no choice but to learn the world around him by trial and error, and it was a difficult path. Then Carmine heard the maid swearing loudly and immediately recognized that maid who was always sleeping during the night duty. Of course, this girl was completely to blame, for she was indeed constantly sleeping meter to look after the ruler of the empire. But thanks to this negligence, the maid managed to find out that there is a possibility to use magic indoors, and this is an important discovery. Although Carmine certainly didn't expect to be attacked by such a strong feeling of weakness. But magic, which so abruptly and quickly used up all the reserve of magical energy, is difficult to call an effective means of defense. And that's why he should somehow try to increase his maximum level of magical energy. It was also impossible to reject the possibility that the loss of consciousness was just a coincidence, and perhaps it was not related to the reserve of magical energy. Some time had passed since then, and the young emperor was once again allowed to go outside and enjoy the sunlight and the scents of flowers. On this day, Carmine decided to start practicing a little light magic, which last time even failed to wake up the race. But suddenly, the attempt to create a magical glowing ball of light was interrupted by a maid who crept up from behind and caught the young emperor doing the strange activity. The excited maid said that in no case should not pick up different things from the floor, because for the emperor it is unacceptable. But Carmine defiantly waved his hands and said that he had not lifted anything, and that he had nothing in his hands. The maid looked at the boy carefully and was convinced that he was right. Then the girl calmed down and made no more claims against His Majesty Carmine. The maid explained that at the moment she had to do some cleaning and asked the young emperor to behave himself, and most importantly not to pick up anything from the ground, and if he needed anything he should call her immediately. Carmine of course did not argue with the maid, because he really wanted to be alone. Carmine also realized that if just a little more, this girl would have guessed about his magical abilities. But the emperor managed to disperse the magical energy in the air in time without losing consciousness. After thinking a bit about his new sensations, Carmine decided that his maximum amount of magical energy in his body was still growing every day, and it was most likely due to the development of his body. It was now much easier to activate his magical abilities compared to his past attempts, and also managed to instantly disperse the entire flow of magical energy, which was very convenient. The young emperor also learned to draw in magical energy from the air very quickly, and this allowed him to better utilize his abilities. Carmine was pleased that he could now quickly recover magical energy, and yet after absorbing it, he felt a sense of fullness, satiety, and overflowing. For several days, Carmine had been practicing continuously and had now figured out that light magic used magical energy to increase and decrease the brightness and maintain light emission. When the maid caught on during the experiment, Carmine tried to quickly dispel the magic and only ended up wasting the accumulated magical energy. At least it seemed so at that moment, because the magical energy seemed to be something fluid and smooth. Carmine visualized this power as a small particle, and the way his body absorbed this particle getting saturated. It was also possible to learn how to calmly activate magical energy in a room, something that had not been possible before and seemed impossible. The young emperor visualized how the particles of magical power through the skin and organs, and this understanding helped to establish the process. By projecting this image into the mind, it became much easier to control his magical powers. Eventually, Carmine called this small magical force his magical essence. When a feeling of fullness appeared, it meant that the magical energy from the air was completely filling the body, and the amount of magical energy that could fit in the body completely depended on the body's ability. But as far as the young emperor realized, his maximum magical energy leaf was still too low, and this needed to be corrected. It was important to figure out what exactly to do next, because the development of magical abilities depended on it. Carmine speculated that perhaps it had something to do with the fact that he could feel the difference between the magical energy inside his body and the magical energy in the air. In the end, the curious emperor decided that this whole process was more like digesting food, because the body worked on a similar principle of absorbing magical energy, and it seemed that the magical energy inside the body was much more concentrated than in the air, perhaps because of the more limited space. When Carmine used magical manipulation to mix the magical energy of his body with the magical energy from the air, suddenly the feeling of being overwhelmed disappeared. All this required tremendous concentration. But if one could accumulate magical energy in one's body in this way, it would greatly help to create magic in the room. Carmine called it a recovery technique, although it was not an advantage if other wizards had the exact same ability. That being said, Carmine realized that if he was destined to be a puppet emperor, it was unlikely that he would be able to get a decent education, and so there was no choice but to try to educate himself. Although Carmine did not really want to become an emperor at all, but as fate would have it, this difficult role fell to him even without his consent. Carmine also noticed how more aristocrats had been coming to see him lately than before, and everyone was trying to tell their point of view and showing feigned care and appreciation. This time some elderly count, who was probably a very powerful man in this not-so-great empire. Carmine didn't understand the point of coming to see him at all. After all, he was just a child, and he was too young to retain for long in his memory not only the name, but also the face of an unfamiliar person. But gradually Carmine began to distinguish the people who belonged to the faction of the Prime Minister, or in other words, the Chancellor, from the aristocrats of the faction of the Ceremonium Master. The people belonging to the Chancellor's faction called him simply Grand Count Rael, while the Master of Ceremonies was called even more simply by his surname Ikinokoreru. At that time, the people of the Ceremoniemeister's faction called their opponent the Chancellor simply Rael, and their leader respectfully Ikinokoreru Philip. And those people who considered themselves independent aristocrats did not add any respectful remarks when addressing the Chancellor or the Ceremonium Master. There were also people whose official position was different from their actual position. But the fact that Carmine was able to learn how to distinguish between aristocrats based on their affiliation with different factions was an incredible achievement for him. It was also a good thing to be able to learn some of the nuances in court life before the young emperor even began to formally speak to the aristocrats. After another such conversation with some very important person, the loyal maid suggested Carmine return to the room. There were always maids around the young emperor, and it was no longer surprising at all, and it seemed that these girls were the daughters of the lower aristocrats, and most likely they were working as maids in order to get a good education at the emperor's court. And of course the maid's habit of constantly gossiping was a valuable source of important information for Carmine, who always listened carefully to their chatter. But most importantly, all these maids considered Carmine as an ordinary child, not a puppet like other aristocrats. For the adult mind inside and the emperor, this caused different feelings, but still Carmine was grateful for this kind of treatment. Thanks to this, the girls always answered any question honestly and happily shared useful information without realizing it themselves. Although of course these questions were quite simple, because it was impossible to arouse suspicion with any serious topics like tricky political processes. And the fact that all the maids belonged to different, opposing factions was very convenient, because they didn't work together and had different information. And since Carmine was a man who had been reborn from another world, he already knew a lot of things, including things that were not typical for such a young age. For example, Carmine certainly understood how to use the toilet and immediately figured out how to do it even with the help of not quite ordinary toilet. But still Carmine sometimes feared that he might be suspected of it, because no one had taught him that. But in the end, the maids decided that the young emperor had already been taught by other girls and no one showed any alarm about it. It was convenient, because the maid actually believed that another maid from the opposite faction had already surpassed her and taught her something new. Thanks to all of this, Carmine didn't arouse any suspicion, and so the anxiety gradually went away. Carmine also learned about how the ancient empire broke up and its vast territory was divided into several warring states, and this period in history was called the Time of Feuds. At the same time, a distant relative of the last emperor Lothar gathered people loyal to him and eventually founded a new empire, announcing that his country inherited all the rights and power of the past empire, and called this empire Bungdalt. And as it turned out, Carmine was the 8th emperor of this empire assembled from fragments. The imperial palace consisted of several palaces, because every new emperor had to build a new palace for some reason. Apparently it was some tradition for the sake of his own image. And now the territory of the palace complex was so large that it was necessary to move around it by carriage. The young emperor at the moment was always in only one mansion, but was very much looking forward to the moment when there would be an opportunity to see the outside world. The mansion that Carmine lived in was built by the 6th emperor, and its size was truly colossal, although it was possible that Carmine was exaggerating, because his young age and small body unwittingly made everything around him look much bigger than it really was. But it was known that this mansion had been the residence of the emperor's son in the past, and this mansion was also the home of the 7th emperor, that is, Carmine's grandfather, His Majesty Edward IV. Of course, Carmine didn't even know what his grandfather looked like, but it was foolish to complain about the mansion where his predecessor lived. Carmine didn't know his grandfather in his past life either, as he simply wasn't in his life. This situation didn't bother the young emperor too much, and so he tried not to think about his grandfather. But then Carmine learned one important thing. As it turned out, in order to become emperor it was necessary to go through 2 ceremonies, receiving the title of crown prince and becoming the throne, and only then would the next ruler of the empire take a seat on the throne. But since Carmine was the direct heir of the previous emperor by birthright, these 2 ceremonies were postponed for the time being. It was for this reason that Chancellor Rael and Master of Ceremonies Philip fought desperately for the right to be the young emperor's regent until he reached the necessary age to ascend the throne. The Chancellor and the Master of Ceremonies also fought for the right to conduct the ceremony of becoming Crown Prince, and as a result, one of the 2 of them in the future had to place the crown on the young emperor's head in front of all the aristocrats of the empire. And the person who would place the crown on the head of the new ruler of the empire would eventually be second in power only to the emperor himself. Carmine decided that he still had no way to influence this process, and so let these 2 treacherous people continue to fight amongst themselves. Especially in this world, there were many sciences, such as geography, magic, and history, which should be studied to better understand the world in which he had to be reborn. In fact, Carmine decided to stick to his personal plan to survive in this country, and eventually make sure to escape as far away as possible from all the dastardly intrigues and stupid power struggles in the stupid empire. The man from another world being in the body of the young emperor wanted to survive at all costs, and not become a toy in the hands of treacherous aristocrats who valued only power in this life. It had been 4 years since the man from another world had been reborn in the body of the newborn emperor of the magic world. Not by his own will had to become the ruler of the state, which at any moment will be torn apart by internal passions, and at the beginning realizing all this, Carmen fell into terrible despair. But then there was hope for a better development of his own destiny, and this hope was magic, which was a common phenomenon in this magical world. Carmen decided to improve his magical abilities and become a strong and independent man who could decide how to live his life. And then when he grew up and gained strength and confidence, he would definitely escape from this hellish place that was the Emperor's palace. The ever-polite maid informed the Emperor that she had brought a suit that had been prepared. This magnificent suit had been made especially for Carmen to wear only once, and such was the wastefulness that imperial etiquette was known for. Of course, Carmine could have dressed himself, but he did not want to arouse the suspicion of the maids, for whom he was just a spoiled child. After all, even a bath had to be taken in the presence of a maid, who performed the most elementary actions for the young emperor. Carmen realized that if they brought him a costume, it meant that he would have to take part in some kind of event. And finally, his first appearance in public as the emperor of this state would take place. Carmen was excited about this event because he was already tired of being confined to the imperial mansion for 4 long years. Because he was very small, and given his high status as the ruler of the state, Carmen was forbidden to go outside the mansion, and this was carefully controlled by all the servants present. For Carmen, it was absolutely indifferent what kind of event was waiting for him today, because the main thing was that he got the opportunity to leave the mansion. It was the first time in his new life that he had been able to ride in a real carriage, for he had always watched these strange carriages pull up to the mansion with the aristocratic guests. The carriage ride was unexpectedly uncomfortable, for the passengers were shaking violently, and everything resembled some silly ride for little children from his past life. But such small inconveniences could not affect the mood of the young emperor, because he was happy as a real little child that at last he could make a trip beyond his home. Sometimes his emotions were strange, and Carmen assumed that it was probably something to do with his physical age, and his small body influenced his psychological state regardless of his adult mind. But Carmen tried to pull himself together at such moments and reminded himself that he was actually an adult who was only in the body of a small child by the will of some higher power. The trip was not that long, and soon the maid informed him that he had not arrived at the right place. Carmen was surprised to get out of the carriage to see a huge church that was in the Western Catholic style, or at least was similar to what Carmen knew of that religion in his past life. The building itself was incredibly huge, and everything seemed majestic and as much as possible pointing people to their imperfection before God. The main stained glass windows depicted a huge ship with some sort of leader on its side. Carmen didn't have any particular religious beliefs, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't too fond of places like this, because everything here looked very flashy and defiant. The same problem was with his imperial throne, which was too exaggerated in its importance. The entire church from the inside was overly decorated, too flashy. Carmine thought that there was probably not a person in this state who had good taste, or just no one spared money for such decorations. But really, none of that mattered, and Carmen decided to concentrate on the event that had brought him to this place. As it turned out, this event was related to the funeral, and for the young emperor it was an unpleasant surprise, because it was a shame to realize that his first trip outside the mansion was on such an unhappy occasion. The maid politely began to explain to the young emperor that he would have to take part in the send-off of the dead man. But Carmen had already realized this and thought why he needed to do it. Carmen only inquired, making his usual childishly surprised face, who exactly should be kept today. Carmen himself sincerely hoped that it would be nice if Prime Minister Rael, or his eternal rival Master of Ceremonies Philip, died. But as it turned out, a man named Norndolemon died, and it caused sincere surprise to the young emperor, because it was the first time he heard such a strange name. But then the maid told him that today was the funeral of grandfather Carmine's concubine, and he, as head of state, had to be here. It did not take long for Prime Minister Rael himself to arrive, who bowed low before His Majesty the Emperor as usual and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Carmen again noticed that this arrogant old man was acting as if he was actually the ruler of the country. But then Carmen decided not to think about it anymore and inquired about the dead concubine. Prime Minister Raoul explained that Carmen's grandfather was in terrible grief after the death of His Majesty the Emperor, and Carmen's mother had purposely locked the 2 concubines in a dark tower. Gradually everything became clear, and Carmen realized that when his father died and his own mother was pregnant, There was a possibility that the concubines could also get pregnant, and so they were specially locked up to avoid unnecessary problems. And even when it turned out that the concubines were not pregnant at all, they still did not let them out of their confinement. And apparently one of them had died because of such horrible conditions, and now they were deprived to organize a showy funeral for her. The young emperor scrutinized everyone present and did not notice the regent here, and in general among the guests were not even his men, which was somehow strange. In the end, Carmen realized that he had been brought here on purpose to be dragged into his own political games. There was no way to influence the situation in any way, and so Carmen decided to wait and see what exactly Prime Minister Raul had come up with. The young emperor decided to show feigned sorrow and said that he was very sorry for the dead woman, because that was most likely the reaction he was expected to get. In Carmine's opinion, Prime Minister Raul was rejoicing at this moment and appeared to him as an evil demon who enjoys manipulating other people. But then suddenly the Prime Minister said that this woman had killed Carmine's 2-year-old brother, and this news stunned the young emperor. The Prime Minister also said that this woman was a simple servant and was not an aristocrat at all, so it was unfair and horrible. Carmine was surprised by the news of the existence of his half-brother, because in that case this child was the heir even before he was born. Although if his birth mother was not an aristocrat, then perhaps he could not become a ruler. It was all very strange, and of course the cunning and devious Prime Minister Raul was obviously not telling us something. But he clearly wanted the regency very much and was trying his best to achieve his goal. From what Carmine had heard earlier, he knew that his grandfather should still be alive, even after his father had died. But apparently the loss of his own son, as well as the death of his first grandchild, had affected his health too much. Although one could not exclude the possibility that Carmine's grandfather was banally killed at the moment when he tried to take some measures after the death of his grandson, and he could well have been killed by the men of the ceremonial master Philip. If one thought well about the whole situation, things were actually becoming obvious, because it wasn't just that all of Carmina's family members were killed one by one. It was all too unlike a normal coincidence. This once again confirmed the fears of the young emperor, who constantly felt the presence of death behind him. Carmine knew that if he let his guard down, he would probably share the fate of his relatives and remain dust on the pages of history. As it turned out, the funeral ceremony was decided to be held by His Holiness, Bishop George V, who looked like a very cunning and devious man. George suggested that all those present honor the deceased with a moment of silence and show respect. Carmine looked at the bishop and realized that this powerful man was Prime Minister Raul's younger brother and therefore his main accomplice. Then George V began his sermon, and Carmine began to realize that the main religion in this empire was a religion called the Holy Way. When saying goodbye to a dead person here, it was customary to say something like that person was going to meet a great saint. And for some reason Bishop George V began to tell about the history of the founding of the Holy Way, and apparently it was an obligatory addition to any ceremony. Carmine noticed that during the bishop's sermon all the aristocrats present, who were sitting in the back, were chatting noisily among themselves and did not show any sorrow for the deceased. Apparently, these greedy and cunning people were just spreading vile rumors, because it is common for people in the status of concubine or emperor to die. The realization of all this made Carmine angry, because now it was obvious that the head of state and the head of religion were in cahoots, and the death of this woman only played into their hands. This sermon, though not directly, was to show exactly who the church supported and would allow them to control the rest of the church in the future. Carmine had heard in his past life that politics and religion always had common cause, and now he was personally convinced of it. In any case, listening to the sermon of the cunning bishop was very interesting and informative. After all, the young emperor was once again convinced of his desire to get away from these people as soon as possible. George V's sermon was about a saint named Ain who once heard the voice of God. However, this man thought it might have been just magic, and so at first he did not believe it. But even then, when God showed the man miracles, Ain still refused to believe in the existence of God. Eventually God made this man a chosen one, in other words gave him divine power. Ain used this power to perform various miracles and finally believed in the existence of God. And then this enlightened man created a doctrine to carry the word of God to the masses. But when Ain tried to speak about God, he was chased away from everywhere, as they considered him a liar and an evil sorcerer who brought evil and deception. And then a couple of followers who believed in the words of Ain, he set out on a distant voyage. During the voyage these people faced many difficulties, but the God-given strength allowed them to overcome all obstacles on their way. Finally their ship arrived on another continent, which they called the Promised Land. The teachings that the saint continued to spread on the new continent grew over time, and that is how the religion called the Holy Way came into being. Carmine, after listening to the entertaining sermon, realized who exactly was depicted on the stained glass windows of the church. The story was indeed very fascinating, and Carmine listened with interest to the story of the divine power that was given to an ordinary man named Ain. The exile of the enlightened Ain, his sea voyage, and how his men reached the promised land was very reminiscent of something from the young emperor's past life. While there were certainly differences from his present home world, it certainly did not change the essence of the religion. Eventually, at the conclusion of his sermon, Bishop George V invited everyone present to bid a final farewell to the deceased. It was not a very joyous moment, but Carmine, as the crown emperor of this nation, had to fulfill his role. Carmine carefully looked at the face of the dead girl and thought that he had never met her, but he was sure of one thing, that she was very unlucky to live in this place ruled by treacherous and deceitful people. After all, even after the death of this woman, she is being used for political game, and they are happy to achieve their goal at the expense of the death of an innocent person. On top of that, Carmine had heard about the death of his father, but this was the first death he had seen with his own eyes in the new world, and he didn't want to get used to the emotions he had experienced. Carmine looked at the majestic stained glass windows of the church and thought about the existence of God, and decided that if God really existed, it would be fair that this woman would receive peace and tranquility after her death. The young emperor carefully watched the whole funeral procedure and sincerely wished this innocent person to rest in peace and finally get rid of the influence of horrible people. At the same time, Carmine of course realized that he himself could not be sure that he would wake up alive tomorrow, because he had fallen into a very terrible place, where intrigue and insidious sneaky deeds were constantly going on. The death of this woman was another proof that it was not safe for such a young emperor to stay here, because his life depended only on the decisions of some people who were not interested in him as a living being. The 7th Emperor Edward IV was a wise ruler who was greatly loved by the people and was Carmine's grandfather. The past emperor had only one son who was Carmine's father. His name was Crown Prince Jean. Prince Jean participated in a war with a neighboring state and took command of the troops on the front lines. This man showed incredible bravery and fought alongside the imperial soldiers. But unfortunately, the crown prince still could not overcome all the opponents on the battlefield and fell in battle, never becoming the ruler of the empire. Upon hearing the news of his son's death, Edward IV fell into despair and grieved greatly for his loss. In the end, the emperor could not withstand the intense grief, he fell ill and died. This is how it was explained by an aristocrat who visited the young emperor and told the chronology of events. The aristocrat told Carmine that even at his young age he had a great future ahead of him, for he was destined to lead a great empire. The flattering aristocrat also promised unlimited support from all the nobles. Carmine quietly listened to all the praises and eventually promised to seek the aristocrat's help when the time was right. The aristocrat was happy with such words from the young emperor, and Carmine had no intention of memorizing another lying person who wanted to gain benefits. Especially lately, there were too many different aristocrats coming to the reception. Carmine assumed that it was all because of that woman's recent funeral, and under the leadership of Prime Minister Raoul. All of this was the result of the Chancellor's skillful propaganda at the funeral, and eventually the impatient members of the Ceremonial Masters faction decided that it was time to spring into action. And after that, people from the Chancellor's faction also began to come and say that the Ceremonial Masters men were very bad and couldn't be trusted. And as a result, the young emperor was forced to listen to someone else's stories every day, which allowed him to learn even more about his empire. At least that was how it was. Because of the death of the past crown prince, Emperor Edward IV died of grief, and for a while the emperor's throne became vacant even though it was wartime. And in this chaos, the most powerful roles in the empire were taken by the ceremonial master Philip and Chancellor Raoul, sharing all the power between them. In order to end the horrible war as soon as possible, these two men decided to hand over some of the empire's territories to the enemy state. Carmine felt that it all seemed too simple for such a complicated process, and it was quite possible that these two cunning schemers had been involved with the enemy long before the war. Although despite the fact that the two men had worked together for some time, they had never become allies. It just so happened that at some point in time, their goal had coincided. Then they wanted to put a convenient person on the throne, who would become a puppet and do everything as they wanted. And for them, that person was Carmine. The realization of this greatly depressed the young emperor, but at the same time motivated him, because it was better to know the truth than to live in ignorance. Before he was born, of course, it was not known whether his mother would give birth to a girl or a boy, and so the only thing to do was to wait. Carmine had not yet been able to fully understand the laws of succession, but apparently a man had priorities over a woman. But in the end, he was born a boy, and so the other heirs, prepared by the Chancellor and the Master of Ceremonies, were decided to be killed for lack of necessity. Carmine didn't understand that it was really necessary to do that. After all, the other heirs were definitely the Crown Prince's child and the child that the dead prince's mistress was carrying. It all looked like a real bloody massacre, and the whole family finally looked like madmen. At the same time, the young emperor did not understand why there was still no civil war in the empire because of the confrontation between the two sides, because the Chancellor and the Master of Ceremonies did not want to give in to each other. But there were two reasons for this. First, there was a huge difference in combat power, and the strength of the Chancellor Rael far surpassed the combat potential of the Ceremonium Master Philip. The Chancellor's France had almost half of the entire empire under their control, and militarily and internally their territory was the most advanced. Therefore, in the case of civil war at the Ceremonium Master did not exist any chance of victory, and that is why the greater power at the moment had Chancellor Rael, and the Ceremonium Master, not seeing any other choice, allowed the enemy to do it. In addition, in the event of the death of the young Emperor Carmine, it was the Master of Ceremonies who was to become the next ruler. This was determined by the law of succession, and the Chancellor could not ignore such a threat. As a result, the people who were higher in heredity than a Kikar were destroyed by his hands. But Raoul did not dare to kill the Master of Ceremonies himself, because in the end he would be considered a rebel who forcibly seized the throne. And as long as there is a faction of the Master of Ceremonies, the danger that there are traitors in the Chancellor's faction will never disappear. Carmine realized that his death was not beneficial to Chancellor Raoul as long as Master of Ceremonies Philip was alive. But that could change at any moment. And the reason why Master of Ceremonies Philip could not kill Carmine was very simple. Because he was the son of his daughter, that is, his own grandson. And no matter how cruel a man would not be this ceremony mister, he did not dare to commit such an act, because if it became known to the public, he would bring on himself indelible shame. And even though Philip would be the first in line of succession, the nobles were unlikely to support someone who killed his own grandson for the sake of power. Carmine realized that he needed to find the perfect balance and try to maintain the equilibrium at least as long as neutrality was maintained. The most important thing was to remain a favorable puppet for both factions, that no one had the idea to make an assassination attempt. At the moment, both camps were interested in brainwashing the young emperor and swaying his opinion to their side. But for Carmine, who has an adult mind and can read people, all these deceitful people will be a great source of information. The main thing is to continue to behave like a normal child of his age, because otherwise he will be suspected of trickery. Carmine played his role perfectly and mentally thanked the idiot aristocrats for the useful information. Another day ended with a servant informing the emperor that the meetings for the day were over and suggesting that he return to the common room. This polite and agile servant was named Herc Ledif, and he was tasked with taking care of the young emperor. The most interesting thing was that Herc was supported by people from the Chancellor's faction and the Ceremonial Master's faction, as well as many independent aristocrats. At first glance, one would think that Herc could be trusted, but in reality, this person was just trying to please absolutely everyone. For example, Herc would tell all parties information about the food that Carmine liked or the food that he didn't like. For the aristocrats, this was important information. After all, if given the chance, aristocrats from different factions would be ready to please the emperor in every way possible. Aristocrats could always ask Herc about it before thinking about how they could please the ruler, and for a small fee, this man was ready to provide any information. In essence, Herc was a money-hungry bastard who was only happy when his pocket was full of gold coins. The waiting room had poor soundproofing, but the sound from the main room was not audible due to the good soundproofing further into the waiting room. Herc had the privilege to enter the waiting room without permission, while other people could only enter the room after his approval. In other words, Herc had the ability to overhear conversations in the main room at any time. And also this man had the power to let guests in to see the ruler of the state. That was why Carmine always needed to pretend to be an incompetent young emperor. It was a life under total control, and Carmine could never relax, for any mistake could be fatal. On one of the usual days, Alexia's own mother, who was acting as regent for her son the emperor, paid an unexpected visit. Herc immediately reminded Alexia that she was not to visit the emperor unannounced. But Alexia reminded him that she was Carmine's birth mom and just wanted to see her little emperor. Alexia actually completely ignored the annoying Herc and his rules of coming over whenever it suited her, justifying everything by saying that she was the emperor's mom. Carmine realized that Hark was unhappy about this because he simply wasn't being paid for such visits. Alexia ordered Hark out of the room and explained that she had an important conversation to have with the Emperor. The servant smiled falsely and quickly disappeared behind the door. Carmine had of course long known that his mother had been acting as regent and pursuing other people's interests in this world. This woman spent all her free time in the company of her lover and very rarely visited Carmine of her own accord. The young emperor wondered if perhaps Alexia was really beginning to sense that something bad was coming when her own son was being used in political intrigue. Though such a reaction seemed too late, Carmine greeted his mother and asked about the purpose of her visit. Alexia immediately stated that Chancellor Raoul could not be trusted as he was up to no good. Carmine of course understood what she was talking about, but pretended to forget who Raoul was. Alexia immediately explained that he was the prime minister who dreamed of taking over the empire. Carmine was surprised by such frankness, because in his mother's eyes he should have been a small child and not understand such complicated things, and so he asked what it meant. Alexia began to explain that the treacherous and evil Raoul had forced Carmine's aunt to forcibly marry her son, and it was unforgivable. Carmine was surprised to learn that the crown prince, his dead father, had a younger sister who was still alive, for this was the first time he had heard of her. The young emperor wanted to know more and showed interest in his own aunt. Alexia was pleased with her son emperor's curiosity and told him that Prince Jean actually had two younger sisters. One of these sisters had become a princess in another state, and the other sister had been forced by Chancellor Raoul to marry his son. Then Alexia made the most alarmed appearance possible and declared that the terrible Chancellor Raoul wanted to get rid of Carmine. The young emperor was surprised by such a flood of information from his own mother, who didn't even think to explain it all or alleviate such stress. But Alexia was not going to stop and continued the story about the perfidy of the Chancellor, who in her opinion decided to put Carmine's aunt on the throne. There was nothing left to do but showing comprehension, and Carmine asked how this was even possible since he was the emperor. Alexia said that according to imperial law, Carmine should indeed be the ruler of the empire, but according to clan law things were a little different. Things were getting interesting, and the young emperor asked what the clan law was. After talking to his mother, Carmine was under a strong impression and thought that this woman was very cunning and devious. At the end of the conversation, Alexia was in a great hurry and explained that if Chancellor Raoul found out about her visit, it could harm her favorite son, the emperor. But Carmine of course realized that this deceitful woman really wanted to be back in the arms of her lover as soon as possible, because she reeked of foreign perfume a mile away. It was obvious that Alexia was a successful mother, who did not care about the fate of her son. But the young emperor was not worried about the bad mother, but only rejoiced at the information received from her. Now it was known that in this empire there were two laws on succession to the throne, and perhaps this tradition was borrowed from the ancient empire of Lothar. One day, the Bungdalt clan decided to settle in this territory, people of whom later became aristocrats. After that there was a collapse of the Lothar Empire, and the power passed into the hands of the Bungdalt family, and later the country was renamed the Bungdalt Empire. In other words, this country is the former Lothar Empire ruled by the Bungdalt clan, and the law of succession of this family was the law of the clan, and the law of succession of the Lothar Empire was called the imperial law. And somehow both of these laws exist and operate at the same time. Under imperial law, the first male of the family inherits the throne, and there is even the possibility of a girl becoming empress. Whereas under clan law, only a male can inherit the throne and a female has no right to become empress. All of this was very difficult to realize and put together, and Carmine had no idea what principle they used to choose the right law. Suddenly there was a knock on the door, and the young emperor wondered who was there. Hark began by apologizing as usual for disturbing His Majesty's peace, and then said that a certain person wanted to meet right now. Carmine asked who exactly had decided to visit him, but the cunning servant said the young emperor would recognize the man himself when he saw him. It all seemed very strange, and Carmine didn't understand why the person who wanted to meet him didn't give his name. But then when he saw Chancellor Raoul, Carmine immediately understood, for this meeting was obvious, especially after the visit of the maternal regent Alexia. Raoul thanked the emperor for receiving him, and Carmine decided that this man was the last person who had not yet attempted to make his opinion known today. Carmine decided to be cunning, stated why they let this man in at all. After all, he was going to kill him, and he didn't want to see Raoul. The Chancellor was agitated after such a reception and asked for some time to talk to him. Raoul stated that it was just a huge misunderstanding, and he absolutely does not wish to harm the great emperor. But Carmine continued to play the capricious child and began to say that he believed the words of his mother, who warned of the danger coming from Chancellor Raoul. But the cunning count of course was not going to back down and explained that all this is really a trivial misunderstanding, which occurred because his foolish son and Mrs. Maria were engaged. And if Mistress Maria were to marry someone from another country, that country could take over the empire and enslave the people. Raoul explained that when he realized such a danger, he decided to act for the good of his state. But His Majesty the Emperor could be sure that this wedding would not happen until he took the throne. Carmine realized that the Maria the Chancellor was talking about was the younger sister of the deceased Crown Prince Jean and his own aunt. And the story of his cunning mother was just an attempt to turn opinion against Chancellor Raoul. There was a big difference between an engagement and a wedding. A wedding could indeed give real power, and most likely Alexia intended to put it wrong to confuse her child, taking advantage of his young age. It was also surprising that Chancellor Raoul had even found out so quickly about the situation with his aunt, who was supposed to supposedly ascend the throne in place of the rightful emperor. There could be no doubt, and it was all the work of the greedy servant Herc, who had of course overheard his conversation with his mother and quickly reported it to Chancellor Raoul. And in this situation the supposedly neutral man was on the side of the Chancellor, and so he let Raoul through without waiting for the Emperor's permission. By the way, if the bloody old woman mother so will come bypassing the butler, the master of ceremonies, and the rest of the aristocrats will quickly realize that you can do without the help of Hark, and it will deprive him of a stable income. And this man simply cannot live without a huge amount of bribes, because he has long been receiving huge sums of money for his services. Carmen understood that Hark feels great only because of his service and his ability to sell important information heard during conversations. But if one were to deprive Herc of this ability, then he would then completely concentrate on selling information. Also, this man directly asked Alexia to stop contacting the young emperor, and it was quite a bold move. Chancellor Raoul stated that did His Majesty the Emperor not realize that his own mother wanted to use him for her own purposes, and so Carmine should not let himself be deceived, because as soon as Alexia has a new child with another lover, she will immediately forget about her main son. Carmine listened to Chancellor Raoul attentively and was surprised to hear such an open criticism of his mother, and so he decided to show some reaction to these words. Carmine replied as naively as possible that his mother had promised to always love him no matter what. Chancellor Raoul was sure that he was talking to a normal child, and so he explained that his mother was currently enjoying herself on a date with her lover and didn't care about her son the Emperor at all. Carmine thought at this moment that how late to the man one had to be to openly say such a thing to a child about his birth mother, even if it was the truth. In the end, the young emperor made a surprised face and replied that he understood what he was talking about and now he wanted to know more. Carmine pretended to be very upset and said that he believed Chancellor Raoul, and the cunning old man expressed his gratitude for his trust. Then Chancellor Raoul, having achieved the purpose of his visit, apologized for wasting the emperor's time and said goodbye. But Carmine decided to play to the end and childishly naively asked Chancellor Raoul if he was really on his side. These words were a real victory for Chancellor Raoul, and he immediately embraced the young emperor and promised to always help him in everything. The Chancellor smiled, enjoying the moment, and promised the little child to always be at his side. Carmine continued to play the foolish child, though he certainly understood the sincere emotions of this cunning man. After that, for several days, Regent Alexia's mother no longer bothered the young emperor with her visits. Carmine thought that in all likelihood both factions had criticized the foolish woman, but something else had actually happened instead. Hark once again entered the room stating that the emperor had new guests arriving, and Carmine asked to be invited to meet them. In the end, the cunning servant invited the girls into the room, and this surprised Carmine quite a bit. As it turned out, these two girls were the maids chosen by Alexia's mother. Their names were Kira and Alicia, and they promised to take care of the young emperor on behalf of the Lady Regent. The girls looked very beautiful and at first glance seemed to be really skillful maids, but all this was of course the tricks of the political game from which the young emperor was already very tired. 5 years had already passed since Carmine's rebirth, and lately all of his worries were related to getting to know the new aristocrats who were constantly coming to visit. Most of these aristocrats presented the attention of their daughters around the same age as Carmine, and it was sometimes interesting and sometimes silly. One could understand that all of these girls were potential brides for the young emperor, and it was interesting for Carmine to see if he would have any choice in the matter. But during these meetings, Carmine realized that the little girls didn't really like him much, for it was evident from their reactions. The aristocrats had pointed out to their daughters to be more open towards His Majesty and show their good mood, but it all looked silly and ridiculous. But by this time, the puppet emperor, as Carmen called himself, was overweight and was not very attractive to the young ladies. Carmen did absolutely no sports and hardly moved at all. At the same time, he ate fatty food every day and therefore naturally became overweight. In addition, all food was tested for poison, and by the time it got on the table the food was already cold and was completely unpalatable. But Carmen realized that even gaining weight had its advantages, because the adults around him were losing their guard, and because of that he could get his own benefits. But unfortunately this meant that in the future would have to give up the harem life in this magical world. But Carmen did not worry too much about this, because he had more important concerns. The young emperor also noticed that most of the aristocrats he met were men, and it seemed that in this world, men had a clear superiority over women. But a few female aristocrats did come to visit, and they all had excellent magical abilities. Most of the wizards in this world were aristocrats. It was quite logical if you consider how aristocrats were born. After all, the first aristocrats became those people who excelled in battles, and in this magical world, possession of magical powers meant the ability to fight well. Wizards were almost the strongest soldiers in the armies of the kingdoms, and in the end everyone stopped as aristocrats, and their descendants kept that status for themselves. Although one could not miss the possibility that magical talent was passed down through inheritance, and in that case, the idea of male superiority lost its relevance, and in its place was the superiority of magical ability. Carmine had originally intended to hide the fact that he possessed magical ability, but now it was obvious that if he didn't display any magical talents, it was difficult to call himself an aristocrat in this society, and that could be the reason for the assassination attempt. As a result, the young emperor decided to scrutinize this issue and find the best solution in the manifestation of his magical abilities. Day after day he had to meet with aristocrats and listen to the constant ramblings of two old men who were constantly fighting for power in this country. Carmine continued to pretend to be an obedient and stupid child and eat cold and unpalatable food. But still, during all this time, the young emperor learned to control his body perfectly, and also greatly improved his telekinesis skills, which was a real achievement, because it was all the result of self-training. In addition to all this, Carmen had created a new invisible barrier spell, which had the function of a small magic shield. Carmen didn't know for sure how strong this shield was, because there was no way to test it in action. But the thought that he had at least some means of defense was comforting and hopeful. The young emperor had also learned to use healing magic, but so far he could only heal small scratches and cuts on his body. But that too was a personal achievement that helped him stay motivated. Carmine was determined to focus on developing his magical abilities in order to eventually use them to escape from the king's trap. In his previous life, there was no magic at all, and now he really enjoyed exploring something previously unknown. In addition, Carmine had managed to learn another very useful spell that could be used against other people. The young emperor would cunningly pretend that he was very sad and crying, so that the maid would start to comfort him and hug him. And then Carmine would use his magic ability and make the girl fall into a deep, deep sleep. This spell was called forced sleep, although of course his maids already slept a lot. But thanks to this spell he was sure that they would not wake up at the most inopportune moment. As it turned out, magic in this world was not activated if the wizard could not visualize the principle of its operation. It was also very difficult to use magical abilities without full knowledge, which apparently was usually obtained from some clever books. As a result, all the results achieved were personal achievements of the young emperor, although in the end, the magic that controlled water he never managed to master perfectly, although the effectiveness of this magical ability pleased with its results. But unfortunately, with the magic of invisibility and spatial manipulation, and progress was not happening, because Carmen could not imagine the principle of such an effect. Carmen also assumed that for sure there were laws and restrictions in this world he knew nothing yet. As a result, the young emperor decided that when he managed to escape from this terrible place, it would be much easier for him to learn magical abilities. But unfortunately, there were still many obstacles on the way to the realization of his dream. But the chances of escape were certainly there. This thought gave the emperor courage and determination and gave him hope. Finally stopping his dreams of the future, Carmine, listening to the temple maid, decided to continue practicing with magic abilities. There were three main types of magic: defense, cure, and stealth to learn. Carmine really wanted to add some more magic-like detection ability to this list. After all, such an ability could be very useful during an escape, for example, to easily detect guards. And it would be ideal to learn how to detect guards through walls or at a considerable distance. To begin with, the young emperor tried to create something like an ultrasonic wave, which would act on the principle of radar. But unfortunately, these attempts were not successful because of the special measures against magical energy in his room. But even with such restrictions, the young emperor had a trump card up his sleeve. This trump card consisted in the internal magical energy that was in Carmen's body, and it was it that the novice wizard tried to use. Thanks to the summoning spell, Carmen was able to see his magical energy. This trick was obtained due to the absorption of heat from the surrounding sources. Carmen was able to create this effect through body control magic. With this, it was possible to absorb more heat from places where the temperature was much higher. But unfortunately, where the temperature was lower than the body temperature, the heat was hardly collected. For this process, the local anti-magic barrier was not a hindrance because heat was not magical energy. The young emperor was sure that if he continued to infuse magical energy into his body little by little, he would not be prevented from continuing his experiments. And in this way, it would be possible to discover other sources of heat. And then all that remained was to visualize what was in those places. Then Carmen tried to project this effect on his retina and was surprised by the result, because he saw the thermal image of his maid, who was still sleeping and snoring quietly. It was all very complicated, but there was no problem using this ability, and it turned out that the long training was not in vain. Next, Carmen decided to continue his experiment and test this ability on something else. With his heat magic, the young emperor could capture sources of heat energy and then use the power of his thought. This allowed him to project the heat source directly onto his optic nerve with his magic, and this allowed him to see an image that radiated heat. It all worked like a thermal imager from a past life, but only based on magical energy. Carmen decided that if he could feel the heat source behind a wall, then he could see through that wall and locate the person. The young emperor remembered all his past failures and decided that today he should definitely pull it off and concentrate as much as possible to achieve the goal. In the end, after a few minutes, the result made him happy and excited, because Carmen, thanks to his new ability, was able to determine the exact location of the two guards who were in the corridor. This success gave satisfaction and hope for a future escape, for indeed Carmen could clearly see the two guards who were just standing at the door of his room. The young emperor realized that his heat magic had now turned into heat detection magic, and this was a very important discovery for future successes. Carmine now had defense magic, healing and stealth magic, and detection magic in his arsenal. All four necessary types of magic were ready, and all that was left was to wait for the right moment to make an escape. But suddenly, looking at the ceiling of his room, Carmine was shocked by what he saw, for he could clearly see the thermal silhouette of a stranger who was in the room a floor above and was somehow watching him. This made Carmen disappointed in everything he had achieved and felt a real anxiety about his life. It was very scary at that moment, because the young emperor immediately imagined that this person wanted to do something terrible to him. Carmen tried to realize who this person was and remembered that there was no other floor upstairs, which meant that this person was on the roof of the building. The young emperor, trying to cope with the fear, hid on his bed and imagined that most likely it could have been an assassin or another guard. Either way, it was bad. Carmen didn't know how long this man had been on the roof in general, and had no idea what his goals were, and that was the worst part. The young emperor realized that this person could see all of his magical experiments that had been going on for days, and if this observer had seen and understood everything, then he must have been passing information about it to his master, who could be anyone. After all, it was obvious that no one but the young emperor could use magic in this room, and so his entire secret of preparing the escape had long since been revealed. Also, the young emperor speculated that perhaps he had some special talent in using magic, because no one else could use magic abilities in this room. And if that was the case, he might be considered special and decide to get rid of him. These thoughts did not give rest, because now everything seemed dangerous and Carmen was expecting an assassination attempt from his enemies every minute. In any case, the suspicious observer was a threat, and now it was necessary to decide what to do in this situation as soon as possible. Carmen also lost the urge to sleep and continued to ponder his future actions. The young emperor continued to try to behave as calmly as possible, but all the following days the cursed watcher on the roof did not disappear, and it began to worry even more, because it was unpleasant to feel watched even at night. The young emperor had no idea who exactly was the owner of this watcher, and what exactly was the purpose of this person. But discarding the fact that this stranger wanted to kill him was certainly impossible. Severe stress, constant fear, and insomnia began to take a heavy toll on Carmine's health as well as his appearance. Eventually, after 3 exhausting sleepless days and nights, the young emperor vomited violently and passed out on the floor of his room. In the end, 3 weeks had passed since the young emperor had discovered the watcher of his room. Despite his physical condition, Carmine continued to assure Hark that he was fine. The young emperor reminded him that it had been a long time since he had lost consciousness, and it should be clear to everyone present that his condition was now much improved and he should not be so worried. Carmine explained to the doctors and servants that he was being prevented from living because of such excessive attention and demanded that everyone disperse immediately. This helped and many left the room. Carmine of course knew that his condition was not the result of poisoning, though since that morning many feared that the young emperor had been attempted to be poisoned, and so every day a bunch of different adults visited him and monitored his physical condition. But the real reason why he lost knowledge from overwork and excitement, of course, lurked in the mysterious watcher who never disappeared anywhere and constantly he took his place on the roof. This person continued to sit upstairs and watch what was happening in the emperor's room. This situation was very annoying and Carmine kept thinking about it and wanted to change this situation somehow. Carmine spent a long time trying to figure out who exactly this person was, but unfortunately he didn't find any answers and finally decided to just give up. The emperor assumed that most likely there were several observers and they changed every day, and that's why it seemed that the surveillance was going on around the clock and every day. It was also obvious that in order to kill the emperor, they would most likely send someone who was excellent at magic, so there was no need to worry that the watcher was an assassin. Carmine also decided that it was likely that the two devious old men were unaware of his magical abilities, because otherwise there would have been a reaction from them by now. The numerous maids could not have suspected of the young emperor's magical experiments either, because during the daytime I cared about it, and at night they slept as usual and thought nothing of it. But it was still a mystery what exactly those watchers on the roof were doing all the time. Carmine didn't feel very good realizing that he was under constant surveillance. In the end, it was officially announced that the young emperor had been poisoned, and so the amount of food and portion sizes were greatly reduced. But thanks to this, Carmine was once again able to return to normal physical shape, because excess weight was harmful to the young man's health. Perhaps because the young emperor had lost weight, the numerous daughters of aristocrats began to look at him in a completely different way and resembled predatory animals devouring their prey with their eyes. The lustful aura of these girls greatly frightened Carmine, but he tried not to show his emotions in public. But one of all these girls, for she continued to still look at the young emperor with undisguised disdain. This girl was the daughter of the Duke of Varn and her name was Nadine de Varn. This girl visited her peer emperor quite often and constantly tried to tease him, taking pleasure in it. Carmine calmly treated these silly jokes and was already used to this attitude. The Duke as usual tried to calm his daughter down and constantly explained that one should treat His Majesty the Emperor completely differently. After all, he is the ruler of the empire. Duke Varn apologized for his daughter Nadine's behavior and called her just a naughty child. Carmine did not give any importance to this, for he was actually more interested in this girl's father. This duke was a representative of independent aristocrats and looked Richter de Varn was very unusual. This man held the position of an imperial general during the war that happened just before Carmine was born. Richter had taken responsibility for the death of Prince Jean, Carmine's father, and so he was stripped of his rank as a general. Carmine had an interest in independent aristocrats, and especially in this man who was a former general of the imperial army and judging by his appearance took an active part in battles. The young emperor knew nothing about the local military, and so communicating with this man, who was an independent aristocrat, brought pleasure and interests. In addition, the scar on the young face of this former warlord made him popular among all the aristocrats, and it was also noticeable that his daughter loved her father very much, which was also a good sign. Another important figure in the neutral nobility was the Count and Minister of Finance Geoffroy de Nimble. This man looked much older than his age because of his unsporty figure and balding head. As Minister of Finance, it was Geoffroy who was carefully trying to keep the finances of the empire, which were getting smaller and smaller every year. The man was one of those in whom Carmine was certain he would not take sides. It was also obvious that money was needed for everything in this world, and in politics, it was no exception. Therefore, if the person who was in charge of the state's finances joined one of the opposing sides, it would greatly change the balance between the chancellor and the master of ceremonies. Therefore, both of these treacherous old men were constantly pushing hard and trying to influence the finance minister. Carmine could only wish Count Geoffroy de Nimble to hold on to his neutrality as best he could, as he was still a child and could do nothing to help the man. Recently, another man had caught the young emperor's attention, who was Count Alfred Lavadet, who promised to side with the faction whose representative would put the crown on the new emperor's head, and it was a fair decision. But at the same time, Count Alfred told almost nothing about himself, but judging from the rumors and stories of other aristocrats, Carmine learned that this man was the head of intelligence and perhaps he was the master of that mysterious observer who had long settled on the roof. The young emperor realized that it was better not to ask the maids or the other servants about this man, because each of them could be his scout, and so the best solution was to personally get close to Count Alfred and find out more information about him. Carmine had a sincere childlike interest in this mysterious man and personally invited Count Alfred to communicate with him. Suddenly the young emperor declared that Count Alfred had no important work to do. This surprised the guest a little, but he still restrained his emotions at such a statement from the young ruler. Count Alfred laughed heartily in response and replied that in fact of course he had an important job and Carmine could care less about it. Carmine noticed that this man was not very talkative and tried not to show his emotions, and so it would be very hard to bring him out. Although one could not expect anything less from the head of intelligence, because that was what a scout was supposed to be. Therefore, the only thing left to do was to try to deceive this man at the crucial moment when he would have to make his outstanding escape from the imperial cage. But for now, one would only have to wait and watch and gather important information. The next day, the young emperor found himself in the reception hall of his residence for the first time in his life. Carmine was indeed surprised that he had never been in this spacious and well-appointed room before. The furnishings were indeed more luxurious than the room where he usually spent his free time and received guests of aristocrats. There was a noticeably larger number of different comfortable furniture for the guests. Carmine asked his cunning and greedy butler about the aristocrats' guests, but Hark explained that today he would have to meet with people from the Velvy Kingdom. Carmine did not expect such strange guests and was not too happy about it. But Hark asked the young emperor to sit down and wait a bit. Indeed, usually everything happened only within his own empire, and Carmine decided that such an unexpected meeting with foreigners might bring some positive changes. In fact, lately he had been seeing only old men from among the local aristocrats, and it was very tiring, because it was boring to communicate with people who looked too old. And perhaps meeting foreigners would be much more interesting and would diversify the boring everyday life. A few minutes later there was a knock on the door and Carmine asked to let the guests in immediately, because he wanted to see someone new in his life. In the end, Herc introduced the first princess of the Kingdom of Velvy, Lady Roselia van Charanier Cruwaer. In 5 years of tumultuous life in his palace, where Carmine was forced to see the same things, this was the first time he had seen such a beautiful girl from a distant land he didn't even know about. There was a combination of beauty and pure innocence in this person. Lady Roselia had a pleasant voice and greeted the young emperor very politely. Carmine felt a sense of excitement and realized that he was really afraid to be around such a beautiful young girl. It also made him curious to know where exactly this kingdom of Velvy was located and what his own empire's relationship was with this state, for he really didn't know anything. Although it could well be a diplomatic move of one of the old men, who despite their advanced age showed incredible ingenuity in the struggle for power and influence, and there was no denying that this girl was just another political trick. But still, it was necessary to find out the purpose of Lady Roselia coming from a distant country to see the young emperor. Also, Carmine was worried that he would have a bad reputation in other countries, because it would have a bad effect on foreign policy. Also, this girl was the first princess of her kingdom and perhaps she had come for the purpose of engagement. But Carmine decided not to rush things and quietly find out all the circumstances of this visit. Hark was nearby and was apparently ready to provide the necessary information to his young ruler. In the end, Carmine decided to show boldness and initiative by telling Lady Roselia that he liked her very much, and therefore he would not mind marrying her. Such a bold statement surprised everyone present, and Hark hastened to explain to his bold ruler that he was at an age when marriage was impossible, but Carmine to do something similar in such a case, and it appeared that it was possible to make an engagement. Lady Roselia instantly blushed with embarrassment, and Carmine asked his butler if it could not be arranged too. Hark hesitated for a moment, and did not quite begin to answer confidently. But Carmine began to insist on his wish and demanded an immediate engagement to the beautiful Lady Roselia. Hark and the maids immediately ran to report on what was happening, because it was obvious that both factions did not expect such a turn of events. Left alone with Lady Roselia, the young emperor asked her to tell him about the kingdom from which she had come. The girl was pleased and promised to tell in detail about her home. But at that moment the young emperor could not help but notice something important. As it turned out, this beautiful girl had never once spoken of the kingdom as her native home, and judging by the conversation, she did not consider it her homeland. The flagship of the fleet of the kingdom of Medelia was making its way through the raging waters of the Dark Sea. The young princess watched the waves with interest and gazed into the distance, hoping to see the shore soon. Captain Geordies Adelson of the Royal Guard decided to chat with the girl and came closer. Despite the fact that they were on board the ship, Geordies congratulated the girl on her birthday and wished the young princess the best experiences of her life. The princess replied that she had left her country at the age of 7, and Geordies immediately remembered that the princess was still a child and she was not even allowed to celebrate her birthday, and now she was forced to meet it on the high seas. The cheerful captain then promised that the entire delegation would make sure that the princess had a good birthday. Lady Roselia thanked the captain for his attention, and Geordies explained that they had already finished all the preparations and so could proceed to a comfortable place. But the girl replied that she still wanted to stay on deck for a while and watch the sea. Lady Roselia explained that the sea breeze helped to put her thoughts in order and think about her future. Geordies promised to be there for her and asked her to call him if she needed anything. Lady Roselia thanked the captain once again for his concern and was left alone with her thoughts. As it turned out, this young girl had traveled across the sea to end up in a foreign empire. The kingdom where this beautiful girl was born was located in the northwest of the continent called the Eastern Continent. This kingdom had prospered when it was part of the Lothar Empire and was essentially a vassal state. This kingdom was never proud of its position, but it was all for the peace of its people, so they eventually resigned themselves to being a dependent state. But such a world was destined to collapse sooner or later, because the lack of independence doomed them to do the will of others. 460th year of the new era, the kingdom of Velv, the capital of Clumaya. During the regular meeting of the ruling elite, there were discussions related to attacks on certain villages. Such attacks ended in total looting and were carried out by fanatics. King Alex van Chalongir was outraged by the terrible news and tried to think of a solution to the problem. The Eastern Continent was home to the Kingdom of Velv and the Empire of Bungdalt. The religion practiced in many countries on this continent was called the Holy Church. Tomi's Asanaki was one of the sects of this Holy Church. This sect included fierce fanatics who were willing to shed innocent blood for the sake of their religion. After the death of St. Ain, this sect quickly gained power, and literally in the blink of an eye, these people began to arm themselves. At the center of their teachings was the return of St. Ain, and they had to prepare the entire Eastern Continent for it. And it was on the territory of the Velv Kingdom that the so-called Promised Land was located, and it just so happened that it was not far from the capital of the Kingdom of Clulea. That was why a confrontation had erupted between the two. It would have been simple if the sect had been more peaceful and similar to other religions that also believed in the Promised Land. Eventually, uniting many sects created the Legacy faction, which became a force that even kingdoms had to reckon with. There were many sects in the Holy Church, and it so happened that evil sects were prevalent in the regions near where the people from the ship landed. St. Ain told these people that he did not accept these wrong teachings, and as the ruler ordered the capture of such people. This was the story of events described in the sacred scripture that was the basis of all religion. There was also a historical fact that there were already people living on these lands, and Ain tried to subjugate them to his will when he landed on the continent. But it had nothing to do with their beliefs. It had to do with the fact that they needed the technology of the people of the continent, and so they tried to seize everything they needed, using their faith as a cover. The technologies of the old continent lagged behind the Eastern Continent in many ways, and among the group of colonists of St. Ain were masters who were able to master these technologies. All modern historians cite the fact that the master craftsmen were adherents to the teachings of Ain as the reason for the growth of St. Ain. Other people call the conflict on the Western continent the result of the confrontation of different beliefs. But one way or another, it turned out that the Kingdom of Velve in the Holy Scriptures dubbed the Kingdom of Evil. Allegedly, they took over the Promised Land and did not let anyone in. In fact, the kingdom itself was still sort of built by the people who drove the settlers of St. Ain out of the land. Its modern Kingdom of Velv has nothing to do with its ancestors. Of course, Velvet Kingdom didn't want to leave things in such a tense state, and to avoid conflicts, the Kingdom of Velv first established the Holy Church as the state religion, and then when they got closer to the empire, they replaced it with the Western doctrine. And after that, everything went wrong, and the great empire of Lothar collapsed, and as a result, the Heritage faction finally got angry. The country that had resigned itself to being a vassal state to avoid war had failed in its choice, and it became enemies of religious fanatics who were willing to become martyrs for their fictional cause. The battles between these opposing sides were always one-sided and characterized by extreme cruelty. By the believing pagans, these unfortunate people who had not yet learned the true faith were the main irritant. and heretics were fallen men who were enchanted by the devil. In other words, there was no punishment for killing them. They called their campaign against the pagans the Holy War and attacked every village and town of the pagans. These mad and cruel men exterminated, burned and plundered innocent people, leaving only death and destruction in their wake. The Tomi's Asanaki sect that was once a minority was able to create a nation and name it after you. Their military might far surpass that of the Kingdom of Velve, and this was the deciding factor in this confrontation. The counselor informed the king that evil fanatics had once again ravaged one of their large agricultural settlements, and so the supplies for the people had been reduced many times over, and this would most likely be the last winter that the starving people would be able to survive. The advisors were diligently looking for a solution to the problem and suggested to accept someone from the imperial family into the royal family. But it was a difficult decision, because the Bungdalt Empire was a neutral state. The advisors suggested directly asking the empire for military help, but unfortunately the empire was too far away, and that didn't seem like a very good realistic idea. The young princess Roselia had long ago grown tired of fruitless discussions that did not lead to any solution. In the end, the girl turned to her father the king and stated that they were just wasting precious time. In the end, His Majesty King Alex exclaimed that he didn't care at all about how they would be thought of, and they should ask for help from everyone in turn in order to find strong allies and save their state or even destruction. The king chose his young daughter Roselia to go with this responsible mission to distant lands, and the girl agreed to help in this. The girl was confident in her abilities and hoped that the Kingdom of Velve would survive the Holy War, which had already lasted for 200 years. Princess Roselia sincerely hoped to return home with success and save her long-suffering homeland from the invasion of evil fanatics. In the end, the huge ship reached the shore, and then the young lady continued her journey overland and reached the capital of the empire. Princess Roselia was delighted by the view of the imperial capital of Cardinalia, which turned out to be more beautiful than she had heard. The girl was looking forward to meeting the ruler, for she considered the empire to be a very strong state with a powerful army. As a result, in a few days Princess Roselia and Captain Jordes could not meet with the most authoritative dukes of the empire, and the high hopes for help began to melt like snow in the sunlight. All desperate appeals to aristocrats from different factions were simply rejected, and this only frustrated the travelers from a distant land. In the end, Captain Jordes suggested that Princess Roselia should go to the next country, and now a road awaited them to the Kingdom of Hismaft, where perhaps they would be welcomed and given military assistance. Princess Roselia knew that the Kingdom of Hismaft was currently at war with the neighboring Tiva Empire, and it would be a miracle if that state would agree to help militarily. But before embarking on the long journey, Princess Roselia decided to meet the emperor in person and inquired if they had such an opportunity. The girl knew that the local emperor was about her age, but already held such a high position. Captain Jordes assumed that they would still be able to get an audience, because Roselia also represented the royal family of her country. In the end, the delegation decided that there was nothing to lose, and if they could not even get military aid from the emperor, they would learn important information about the ruler of the empire. From the point of view of diplomacy, it is always better to know more information about the rulers of neighboring states, because it develops attitudes in foreign policy. And even if the negotiations would not bring any significant help, it would still allow them to establish contact for future negotiations. Princess Roselia agreed with her advisors and said that for the moment their fate would depend on the young emperor with whom she would meet. The first to greet the delegation from the Kingdom of Velve was of course the butler Hark, who was polite as always, but asked the guests to wait for permission to meet. Eventually Hark announced that Her Highness Princess Roselia would be the only one who could meet Emperor Carmine, and this did not please Captain Jordes. The captain explained that he was a guard of the royal family and was obliged to be near the princess, but Roselia did not want to argue and asked the loyal captain to wait for her. The young princess stated that they were already occupying the local emperor's precious time, and so they should make their own demands for the meeting. Roselia then asked the butler Hark to escort her to the emperor, and the cunning servant thanked the girl for her understanding. Following the butler, Princess Roselia thought about the fact that Hark is probably a faithful servant of his ruler, and if she immediately told about her problems, most likely she would not be listened to, and so she should be more careful. Roselia felt like a selfish person, but then she remembered that to save her homeland she should take any opportunity, and even show cunning to the local emperor. From the point of view of those around her, she is definitely considered a petty and despicable representative of her kingdom, so there is no need to think about any moral principles. In the end, Herc led the girl to the door and offered to go inside. Princess Roselia tried to gather her strength as much as possible and once again reminded that all her actions should help her native kingdom and therefore she does not care what people around her will say about her. In the end, the young princess was surprised by the sight of the local emperor and even confused. Hark introduced Carmine to Princess Roselia, who had come from the distant kingdom of Velv for an audience with him. The girl introduced herself to the young emperor according to etiquette and explained that she was pleased to meet his majesty. Princess Roselia noticed the young emperor's surprised look. She noticed that even though Carmine looked like a child, his eyes looked like those of a grown man or a wise elder, and it seemed strange. But then, after a short conversation, the young emperor confessed his sympathy for Princess Roselia, and it was a complete surprise for all present and of course for the girl herself. Until now, neither the Chancellor nor the Master of Ceremonies had reacted at all to the problem of the Velv Kingdom, and they were just waiting for them to leave their country when they realized that no one would help them in the conflict with the fanatics. Chancellor Raoul believed that one cannot expect much in return from a country that is on the verge of extinction, and therefore it is foolish to waste energy on help. Master of Ceremonies Philip also didn't want to waste resources and money on a useless endeavor. But at the whim of the emperor, the puppet Emperor Carmina was unexpectedly made an engagement proposal to a foreign princess, and it was a surprise to the two old schemers. No one expected that the young emperor would have his own desires, which turned out to be completely unpredictable. And everyone immediately realized that the one who would fulfill the young emperor's wish would become the closest person to him. Both factions were in a difficult situation, because Chancellor Raoul and Master of Ceremonies Philip realized that this is a great opportunity for them to get as close as possible and become the main ally of the young emperor. Carmine decided that even if both of them didn't really want to help, they would have to do so in this situation to get ahead of each other and prove their loyalty. A little later, the two cunning old men declared that they are very serious about the emperor's wish and are ready to get into the heart of the problem and help. The two irreconcilable rivals also decided to discuss the emperor's engagement together and then try to solve the problem of the Velv Kingdom up to the point of providing military assistance. In the meantime, the representatives of the Velv Kingdom had managed to visit other countries in search of the needed help. It came as a surprise to many that the young Emperor Carmine had decided to help the Velv Kingdom, and in the end everyone decided that the engagement to Princess Roselia was the main factor. In addition, several other countries agreed to support the Kingdom of Velv, and it proved to be a real success for the mission and a salvation for the nation. When the royal fleet returned to their homeland, the season had already changed and a harsh winter had set in. In addition, the situation in the Kingdom of Velv had changed dramatically, and Princess Roselia was happy to report the success of her mission. His Majesty King Alex thanked his favorite daughter for her efforts and admitted that he did not even expect such success. As a result, thanks to the support of different states, people were able to survive the harsh winter and also managed to return previously lost cities and repel enemy troops far from the brave parts of the kingdom. Princess Roselia asked her father why he was not happy, because their kingdom was saved by common efforts. King Alex asked the girl to set aside all formalities, as they were in this room just the two of them, and explained that of course their kingdom had been saved and he was happy about this event. But there was something that bothered him. The worried father explained that he was constantly thinking about his engagement to Emperor Carmine and didn't understand how it could have happened during their first meeting, for it was very strange. King Alex then explained that as far as he knows, this young emperor is just a foolish puppet in the hands of the court aristocrats, and if their kingdom didn't have such serious problems, he would never have asked for help from this man. King Alex explained that as a father he was very worried about the fate of his beloved daughter and stated that she should never have agreed to this engagement. And even though they are about the same age, this young emperor is still 2 years younger than Roselia, and it was foolish to make such a sacrifice. Princess Roselia was surprised when she heard that Carmine was a puppet, because she sensed a completely different aura from this guy and felt his inner strength. And also the girl remembered his eyes, which were mysterious and hid many secrets, and she couldn't even believe that Carmine was younger than her. Despite her father's words, the girl was sure that the young emperor would be able to rule the country, and perhaps even the whole world. In the end, Roselia told her father that he was wrong, and personally she was sure that His Highness Emperor Carmine would become a great man, and she would be happy to support him in any endeavor. King Alex was surprised by such confidence of his daughter and asked that perhaps she should give up the engagement and think about the fact that all this is the result of emotions. But the girl explained that if she broke the promises she had made, it would greatly affect the prestige of the kingdom, and this could not be allowed. Besides, she personally, as a princess of her native kingdom, must fulfill her duties and keep her word. After these words, King Alex cried and confessed that he was grateful to his daughter for taking such care of his native kingdom. Princess Roselia asked her father to calm down and promised that she would be all right. At that moment, Queen Berby entered and welcomed her favorite daughter back and congratulated her on the success of the mission. The queen then asked Roselia to tell her as much as possible about her future engagement, for as a mother she must know everything. Berby asked her favorite daughter to stop pretending to be an adult and immediately explain everything she had already learned about love. The young princess was embarrassed and instantly blushed and began to explain that she was only doing her duty to the kingdom and was ready to make such a sacrifice. But the queen of course did not believe in her daughter's words and was sure that sincere feelings were involved. Embarrassed, Roselia promised to tell her mother about everything later and suggested that she talk to her father about important matters. Roselia was truly grateful to her parents for keeping the kingdom intact for many years and decided that this time it was her turn to take care of her parents and her country. Roselia was ready to become a princess and consort for the young Emperor Carmine, for she really wanted that, and also wished to meet her chosen one soon.